Today I'm going to be telling you 10 plus stories of wilderness adventures gone wrong. Now, I've hiked thousands of miles over the years, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that going off into the backcountry is like an instant death wish or anything crazy like that. But at the same time, on rare occasions, hikers do die on their adventures. And on even rarer occasions, sometimes they just disappear. They leave the trailhead and then they're never seen again. And speaking of those missing hiker cases, well, I'm going to be covering a number of them in this video. We're also going to be taking a look at some last photos of hikers, and we're just going to be diving right into the world of outdoor mysteries. So with that said, hit that subscribe button. We're almost at 500,000 subscribers, and so if you could help us get there, that would be really, really cool. I would appreciate it. And yeah, buckle up, folks, because, well, here we go. In this video, I'm going to be telling you some disturbing and honestly just plain up stories of hikers who vanished from the trail and weren't recovered until years later. Though hiking is usually a very safe activity, on rare occasions things do go fatally wrong, and as if that's not scary enough, the prospect that you could disappear for years without your friends and family knowing why or what happened is certainly even scarier. So with that said, let's take a trip to the beautiful and rugged mountains of the great state of Idaho, where in July of 2023, a hiker who was off trail deep in the backcountry made the kind of discovery that's normally reserved for nightmares. So in June of 2016, this gentleman named Jack Thomas set out on a solo backpacking trip in Idaho's Sawtooth range, and he left from the Queens River trailhead. Now, Thomas was a very experienced outdoorsman. He was the kind of guy that felt perfectly comfortable hiking into very remote areas all by himself, and all of that despite the fact that he was 66 years old. Now, this story is not just all about his age, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, and it's also worth mentioning that as an added layer of safety, Thomas actually brought a satellite GPS device with him, and I talk about these devices a lot. They basically would have allowed him to send and receive text messages as well as call for emergency help from anywhere in the wilderness, regardless of cell connection. These things work through satellite technology, and we know that his device was in fact working because on June 15th, he actually used his GPS to send out his exact location to his family back home. This was a routine check-in, and at the time, it seemed as though everything with his hike was going according to plan. So Jack Thomas was supposed to return from his hike the following day. That would be June 16th, but unfortunately this never happened. After his check-in the previous day, there wasn't any more activity from his GPS, and it didn't take long before it became very apparent that something had gone wrong while he was in the backcountry. I mean, how the hell could a man who was carrying and routinely using a satellite GPS simply just vanish in the wilderness? A search for Jack Thomas was launched, and this search involved officials from both Elmore and Boise counties in Idaho. The government also called in a volunteer organization called Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue. Now, in case you're new to this channel, these privately run volunteer, emphasis on the volunteer search and rescue groups exist all over the country, and they're really the unsung heroes of the backcountry. Many of these groups are also extremely underfunded. Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue actually raises a significant portion of its budget by selling hot buttered corn at the Western Idaho Fair, for instance. So in an effort to give back to this group, I've made a donation to them, and I encourage you to do the same. It doesn't have to be like a crazy amount, just a couple bucks, something like that. It would be much appreciated, and I'll have a link to their website in the description if you're interested. So they're searching for Jack Thomas. They search, and after nearly 2 weeks of this, they still hadn't found any evidence about what had happened. Investigators found no clothing, they found no discarded hiking gear, and they definitely didn't find Jack Thomas or his body. And so eventually the government had no choice but to call the search off, and they did this because of lack of evidence. But Jack Thomas's family did in fact press on, utilizing private organizations to continue searching for answers. And unfortunately, over 7 years would go by before these answers would finally be found. And when they were found, by the way, it would go on to not only affect the friends and family of Jack Thomas, but also the hikers who accidentally solved the disappearance of Jack Thomas. So over 7 years after he disappeared, an anonymous hiker and one of his friends were hiking in the Sawtooth wilderness. Now, I'm going to refer to this hiker as an anonymous hiker, or our anonymous hiker, because I tried to reach out to him to see if I could include his name in this video, but he never got back to me, so I just want to keep his name out of it. So our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner were about halfway through a 6-day excursion in the backcountry when they actually decided to leave the established trail system that they were camped on and create their own route through the wilderness. The reason that they did this is because they wanted to reach these unnamed alpine lakes that didn't have any like official trails to them. So our anonymous hiker was actually well aware of Jack Thomas, who had gone missing 7 years earlier, like I said. And the reason that he was familiar with this story was because the area that Thomas had disappeared from was actually one of this anonymous hiker's favorite places. This hiker was quoted saying, he, referring to Jack Thomas, just happened to vanish into the part of the wilderness that's my favorite part to go into. The year after Jack went missing, I did a route really similar to his, and it was always in my mind, are we going to stumble upon something out here? And while this hiker wouldn't stumble upon Thomas's remains that first time, in July of 2023, as you could probably predict, that is exactly what would happen. Now, when you're in the backcountry, any like sign of human beings kind of sticks out to you, right? I'm talking about things like discarded gear or clothing, even something as small as like a candy bar wrapper that was left on the side of the trail. These things that aren't natural will catch your eye because it just looks different than everything else that you're looking at. And of course, when you're hiking off trail, this phenomenon is going to be magnified times, who even knows, a ton. Because when you're that deep in the backcountry and you're not following an established path, I mean, if you think about it, there's a pretty good chance that no other human has ever walked over that same spot, let alone accidentally dropped some gear or left something, you know, something like that. And I'm telling you this because I want to illustrate just how shocked our anonymous hiker must have been when he walked right up to a weathered pair of pants turned inside out with the underwear still attached. This anonymous hiker said, quote, "This," referring to the discovery, "was kind of a shocking thing to come upon. We were over 20 miles into the wilderness area." He also said, quote, "I knew something bad had probably happened. That's not something you usually find in such a remote place." Immediately thinking that the pants could have belonged to Jack Thomas, our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner started just looking around for more discarded items, and unfortunately, it didn't take long before they found a hiking boot. Referring to this discovery, our anonymous hiker said, quote, "I knew that somebody must have died there because you're not going anywhere without your boots," which is very valid. I mean, how could you hike into an area, lose a boot, and then still make it out? Like, I mean, that just doesn't happen. And so obviously this was not a good sign. The two men continued searching around and they continued to find various clothing items. And then finally they stumbled upon undeniable proof that they had accidentally solved the mystery of Jack Thomas. While they were searching, our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner found a wallet which contained cards, IDs, things like this, with Jack Thomas's name on them. So the hikers make this discovery. They note the GPS coordinates where they found everything, and then they spent the next couple of days hiking back to the trailhead. Once they made it, they immediately contacted the authorities, and soon after this, a task force of investigators, coroners, and search and rescue volunteers made their way back to the location where they found even more items. So these searchers recovered Thomas's cell phone, his iPod, his backpack, and eventually his remains. Interestingly enough, they also recovered his satellite GPS, which had not been used to signal an emergency at the time of Thomas's disappearance. So the obvious question here is, what the hell happened to Jack Thomas? And the answer is, unfortunately, that we don't really know, at least not exactly. We can, however, make some educated guesses based on the location where Thomas was found and also on the gear that he was carrying, particularly that satellite GPS. So here's the timeline. Investigators believe that Thomas was hiking on the Benedict Lake Trail, and just as our anonymous hikers had done years later, Thomas decided to hike off trail to check out a nearby alpine lake. So as he was coming back down from this lake, so they do believe that he reached it and then turned around, he was roughly a half mile away from the established Benedict Lake Trail at this point. Something happened very suddenly that either killed Thomas or just left him unable to move, making him vulnerable to the elements and eventually leading to death by exposure. This would explain why he didn't hit his satellite SOS button on his device that we know he knew how to and was willing to use. So there's a few things that I want to point out about this story. First of all, I'm going to try to get ahead of what I think some of my very well-meaning viewers might comment, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. It has to do with Thomas's age. So he was 66 years old, and obviously at that age, he is going to be at higher risk for an accident while solo backpacking, especially if he was hiking off trail. Now, before you rush to judge him for this, I do just want you to remember that he was extremely experienced in the backcountry, and he was almost certainly well aware of the potential risks that he was undertaking by hiking solo. In addition to that, Jack Thomas was doing everything right with his gear, and he was carrying that satellite GPS that he could have used to call for help. And speaking of that, by the way, on this channel, I always advocate for hikers to carry these devices. I've even got a few of the popular ones tagged at the top of the description if you're curious about them and you want to check them out. But this story obviously is proof that no matter how many precautions you take, it's impossible to eliminate all risk in the outdoors. And so even if you're carrying one of these devices, they're not foolproof. And at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to make our own decisions about how much risk we're willing to tolerate. Clearly, Jack Thomas felt comfortable going solo in the backcountry, and unfortunately, that risk that he took did end up catching up with him. I wish that he was still alive today, obviously. I hope you do too, but at least he died doing what he loved, and at least he died in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. My heart goes out to him, and my heart also goes out to his family. For our next story, we're going to take a trip to a European country that is at the top of my list to visit someday. I've never been to Europe, but I definitely want to go there. That would be Switzerland. If you're one of my European viewers or you're well-traveled, you can comment and let me know if I'm right or wrong about this, but regardless, we're taking a trip there now, and this trip is free. But if this is your first time watching the channel, you must leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you're from. And if you're a repeat viewer, you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission on this trip. You'll also be helping us inch a little bit closer towards our goal of 1 million subscribers on the Kyle Hates Hiking channel. And so subscribing, it's totally free and it's much appreciated. So from the photos and videos that I've seen, Switzerland looks absolutely stunning. I'm not kidding. I really want to go there. But beneath all that beauty, there is some subtle hidden danger, you could say. And this subtle hidden danger could potentially produce a scene like this. In July of 2023, this horrifying sight is exactly what a group of climbers in the Swiss Alps stumbled upon. On July 12th, these anonymous climbers were making their way along the Theodul Glacier, which is near the Matterhorn, when they discovered all of that discarded gear, and they also discovered some human remains. They did what I hope all of us would do in this situation, which was report it. They reported their findings to the Swiss authorities, and shortly after, some details about this deceased climber were announced to the public. And when this happened, the story went super viral. I mean, it made headlines all around the world. Even my local news station had an article about this case. I mean, it was just extremely popular, which I find very interesting because despite its virality and its popularity, there's really not much information available about this story. I will tell you what we know about this disturbing photo. So the Valais Cantonal Police, Valais, I hope I said that right, they released a statement which said that the remains belonged to a climber who had disappeared 37 years ago. I mean, that's just crazy, right? 37 years. I think that, along with like the disturbing photo of the scene, you know, that combination is why I believe the story went so viral. And yet, again, despite the popularity of the story, we don't even know the name of the climber. And that's because the Swiss authorities just haven't released it, at least not yet. We do know that this climber was a 38-year-old from Germany who disappeared on a hike in September of 1986. The police used DNA technology to find the identity of this man, and they explained that the discovery was a result of receding glaciers in the area. This is not the only time this has happened, by the way. In 2015, the bodies and the gear of 2 missing Japanese climbers were also discovered near the Matterhorn. Apparently, these 2 mountaineers had perished in a dangerous snowstorm all the way back in 1970. This disturbing trend of discoveries doesn't stop there either. In December of 1979, 27-year-old Jonathan Conville set out to climb the north face of the Matterhorn with one of his friends. So Conville was from Britain, and he was a very skilled mountaineer. But with that said, this particular route was very difficult, very technical, and very, very dangerous. On Christmas Day, Conville and his climbing partner made 6 hours worth of progress up the mountain before having to stop and camp for the night. They woke up the next morning and they continued their push up until they were roughly 1,600 feet or about 500 meters away from the summit of the Matterhorn. So they're obviously super close to reaching, you know, their goal, the summit of the mountain, but unfortunately, the unpredictable mountain weather did catch up to them at this point. It was storming, it was just so dangerous up there, and so they decided to abandon their summit push, even though they were so close, and they instead started to traverse over to an emergency hut where they knew that they could have some shelter and that they could wait for rescue. They began descending, and as they did this, a rock underneath Conville came loose and he instantly fell out of sight of his friend. Now, this friend did end up making it to the hut, and this friend was later rescued by helicopter, but unfortunately, Jonathan Conville was nowhere to be found. He was obviously presumed to have died in that accident, but the location of his body remained a mystery throughout the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. I mean, well over 30 years went by, but then in 2013, a Swiss helicopter pilot noticed some abandoned climbing gear while he was flying, you know, above the mountain. This sighting was definitely concerning, and so it was investigated, and as it would turn out, this was not just some random pile of discarded equipment. It was actually a site that contained human remains. And along with these remains was a shirt that had the name Jonathan Conville written on it. Conville's siblings provided DNA samples, and soon after, it was unsurprisingly confirmed that Jonathan Conville had been found. The silver lining to this story, I guess, is that Conville's family would actually end up starting the Jonathan Conville Memorial Trust, which works to, quote, honor Jonathan's legacy by equipping young climbers with the skills and understanding they need to explore the mountains safely. I think that's really cool. I mean, they could have just been like totally against climbing after it killed their loved one, but that's not what they're doing. Instead, they're trying to get more people out there in a safe manner. I'll actually have a link to this trust in the description if you're curious and want to learn more about it or learn more about Jonathan Conville's story. So the discovery of Conville's remains was also linked to receding glaciers on the Matterhorn, just like the more recent discovery of this anonymous German hiker. If this trend continues, I have a feeling that a lot more families out there may finally be getting some answers about what happened to their loved ones who disappeared while they were climbing. And speaking of families getting answers, that's exactly what happened in our next story. Except just like in all the previous stories, this one also took just way too long for these answers to finally come. In October of 2019, 28-year-old Rachel Lakaduck set out into the Washington state wilderness on a hike that she'd been planning for quite some time. Now, Rachel had become fixated on spending the night at a place called Hidden Lake Lookout, which is a cabin that actually sits on the border of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest and North Cascades National Park. The cabin is located at roughly 6,900 feet or some 2,100 meters in elevation. Rachel had originally planned to do this overnight backpacking trip with her husband. They almost did it in 2018, in fact, but they kind of decided last minute that they just weren't physically ready for this, and because of that, they scrapped their first attempt. They didn't give up the plans entirely, though. They kind of said, like, okay, we'll do it in 2019, I guess, but unfortunately, they ended up having some relationship problems, and that definitely threw a wrench into their plans. And so by the end of the summer of 2019, their marriage had fractured. And though they didn't actually get divorced yet, Rachel had moved out of their home at that point, and the couple was separated. But despite this, Rachel was still determined to spend the night at the lookout. And thus, on October 17th, 2019, she drove herself to the Hidden Lake trailhead and she parked her car. Her plan was to hike the roughly 4 miles of steep, rough, uphill terrain until she reached the cabin at the lookout, and then she was going to spend the night and then hike back down to her car the following day. Tragically, once Rachel left the safety of the trailhead, she would never make it back alive. So I really need to point something out right now, and this is probably something that a lot of you might have already noticed, especially if you're an experienced hiker in the North Cascades. So what I'm talking about here is that October 17th is pretty late in the season for somebody to be hiking at almost 7,000 feet in elevation, at least assuming this person isn't like an experienced hiker in cold, snowy, and icy conditions. Now, I'm not sure how much backcountry experience Rachel had, but I do know that it's easy to underestimate how dangerous the higher elevations can be in October. I mean, down in town, it might be fairly warm still. It probably won't be snowing, but up on these mountain peaks, it can definitely be just straight up winter conditions at that time of year. My understanding is that the reason Rachel set out so late in the season was because this hike was actually a celebration of her 28th birthday, which was October 17th, the very same day that she left. And as it would turn out, Rachel's birthday in 2019 would also coincide with the very first winter storm of the year. Once again, the conditions at the lower elevations were manageable, but as Rachel climbed higher and higher, the snow, the wind, the ice, and the cold would have become worse and worse. I mean, visibility was limited, and the falling snow had started to hide the trail. I mean, it would have been very difficult to see where the trail was and to follow it. When Rachel was a little bit further than like the halfway point through her climb, she actually encountered a pair of hikers who were coming back down the trail. So they kind of passed in opposite directions. Now, these hikers had also been climbing up towards the lookout, but they were ahead of Rachel. They'd started earlier, and when they finally got above tree line, the conditions were just awful. The conditions had deteriorated so much, and these hikers made a wise decision to turn around. So when they passed Rachel, they chatted with her for a few minutes, and they did reportedly warn her about the dangerous conditions that were up ahead of her, but they also said that Rachel looked confident and she looked strong. Whatever happened during that encounter, it did not dissuade Rachel from continuing her hike, and so they passed each other. Rachel continued climbing, and unfortunately, these hikers that she chatted with would end up being the last people to ever see her alive. The very next day, Rachel was supposed to get home from her hike, and then later she was supposed to meet up with one of her friends, but she failed to show up to this meeting, and she also failed to respond to any attempts to contact her, by the way. And so because of this, she was quickly reported missing, and her car was soon found parked at the Hidden Lake Lookout trailhead. This was a disturbing find because it was clear at this point that Rachel had not made it off of the mountain. The inclement weather in the area, the very same weather that presumably led Rachel astray, also made search efforts extremely difficult. I mean, they weren't even able to make it to the cabin initially. This was significant because they hoped that Rachel had actually made it to the cabin and was just taking shelter inside, waiting for rescue there, and that's why she hadn't returned from her hike. However, this cabin was finally searched on October 22nd, and of course, Rachel, she wasn't in there. Because of this, it appeared as though she had vanished somewhere between the cabin and the location that she had her encounter with the two descending hikers. They searched hard for 10 days after Rachel disappeared, but unfortunately, after this, the official search was suspended. However, private searchers working with Rachel's family actually continued search efforts, and the craziest part about this is they did not stop for literal years. Now, from what I can tell, the man who organized, we'll say, the bulk of the search efforts after the government stopped searching was named Bud Carr. Now, if you do like a Google search on Bud Carr, you'll quickly see that he kind of has like a controversial story, or at least that's what the media makes things seem like. Who knows what's true, but I'm not gonna get into any of that because it pales in significance to the events that happened on August 14th, 2021. On that day, Carr, a man named Kevin Dares, and a few other anonymous searchers were out on yet another attempt to find Rachel when all of a sudden Kevin Dares stumbled upon some weathered backpacking gear. After some brief radio conversation between the searchers, they determined that the backpack, sleeping bag, and sleeping pad that Dares had found matched the color and description of Rachel's missing gear. Dares also reportedly noticed some red hair as well, and so nearly 2 years after she had vanished, Rachel Lackaduck had been found. When I was researching this case, it quickly became apparent to me that the discovery of Rachel's remains was, we'll say, much different than most other cases that I've covered on this channel. I could be wrong about this, so somebody please correct me if that's the case, but I think Bud Carr and his team, they weren't like an official nonprofit or volunteer search and rescue organization, and they definitely weren't with the government. Instead, they were just a group of private citizens who wanted to serve Rachel's friends and family and wanted to find her. And this is a somewhat controversial concept, you know, private people going out and trying to solve these cases. But regardless of that, you cannot argue with the results in this case. Hats off to Bud Carr and his team. And with that said, again, the obvious question in this case is what the hell happened to Rachel? Unfortunately, again, we'll probably never know for sure, but it's likely that she took a wrong turn due to the trail being covered in snow and not being able to see it. And then eventually she decided that she needed to just bushwhack back down the mountain. And then at some point, she likely settled down to try and like seek refuge from the bad weather. And in this place that she chose, she ended up just perishing, probably due to exposure. A very, very sad story. And there's two things about Rachel's gear setup that I think could have led to less tragic results here. I'm definitely not trying to criticize Rachel. Let me be perfectly clear about that, but I just can't help but wonder if things might have ended differently if she was carrying a tent or a shelter with her. Also, to be clear, I'm not 100% sure what her gear setup was. So again, if I'm wrong about this, somebody please correct me. I'm trying to, you know, only say the truth here and serve you guys. With that said, I don't think that Rachel was carrying a tent, presumably because she was planning on staying inside that cabin at the lookout. It's certainly possible that just a tent alone wouldn't have been enough to save her life, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt either. So with that said, I urge all hikers, even if you're planning on staying in a backcountry structure or like a shelter or something like that, you should always carry a tent or at least like a bivvy, a backup shelter in case you don't actually make it to the structure you're planning on sleeping in. I didn't read any reports that Rachel was carrying a satellite GPS either. And as we learned earlier in the video, these devices aren't foolproof, and so you can't say that it certainly would have saved her life, but it definitely, I mean, I think there's a pretty good chance that it would have made a big difference. If she was stuck there, if she was hunkered down, she could have hit the SOS button and they would have been able to find her location and rescue her before she died. Those are some important lessons that I took away from this story. May Rachel Lackaduck rest in peace, and my heart goes out to her friends and her family. So before we get into our next story, I want to just lighten things up for a minute and tell you about how much I sweat. No, I'm not joking. I promise there's a legitimate reason why I'm telling you this, and that legitimate reason is because, well, this video is sponsored by Drink Element. Drink Element is the #1 electrolyte drink mix company in the game. I know a lot of you are hikers, but even if you're not a hiker, if you're going to the gym or doing yard work, shoveling snow pretty soon here, if you're doing anything that makes you sweat, you need to replace your electrolytes. It's not enough just to drink water. When I don't replace my electrolytes, I get muscle cramps, I get fatigued. It's really, really noticeable. And once I realized this, I started to go out to like Walmart or grocery stores and just buy whatever electrolytes they had. And honestly, they all sucked. They were full of sugar and crap. They didn't taste very good either. That's another big thing. And Element is like the polar opposite of that. Element has no sugar. It has no BS. All it has is the electrolytes that you need to stay healthy and hydrated, and it has an amazing taste. They have so many different flavors. It's one of the coolest things about Element. Citrus salt or grapefruit salt, orange salt. If you have a more creative palate, well then Element is perfect for you. They have these out of the box flavors like chocolate salt, for instance. They have another one called mango chili. I mean, how crazy awesome is that? You're gonna absolutely love it. And the thing is, guys, to really get the full Element experience, it's not enough just to try one of their flavors. So here's what you can do. You can go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link right at the top of the description. Go to that link and make a purchase of whatever flavor you think sounds best. And when you do it through my link, well, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. So you're gonna get to try all these amazing flavors that I'm raving about so much. So one more time, go to drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link at the top of the description. Sponsors like Element are honestly what allows us to make a 3+ hour long video for you guys. We really appreciate them, and we appreciate you for supporting our sponsors as well. So go check them out, and let's get back to the video. These disturbing photos turned a mysterious death case in Panama into a viral sensation. 2 young women vanished on what was supposed to be a fun hike through the jungle, and for 10 weeks, nobody knew what the hell had happened. But then, the discovery of their discarded backpack broke the case wide open, because inside of the backpack was a camera. The discovery of the girls' partial remains soon followed. Their camera contained over 100 photos, and investigators hoped that it would shed some light on their timeline and into what could have possibly happened. But instead of providing answers, these photos simply did the opposite. The images spread rapidly throughout social media platforms, and in just a short amount of time, it seemed as though everybody with an internet connection had a theory on what had happened. Many claimed that the girls had just gotten lost and died as a result, while others claimed the photographic evidence was clearly pointing towards foul play. Some people were even convinced that the girls were captured and eaten by cannibals. In this video, I'm going to be doing my very best to tell you the objective story of Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. I'm going to be giving you the facts as I understand them, without the spin and without bias. And at the end of the video, I'm going to reveal to you the truth about this story. And honestly, I have to warn you, it's probably not going to be what you want to hear. So, let's start off with the elephant in the room, or at least the elephant in my room as the one who is making this video. The story of Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon is one of the most well-known and well-covered mysteries on the internet, full stop. There have been countless podcasts, YouTube videos, and documentaries done on this case. Tons of journalists have published articles about it, and there have even been books written about this case, multiple books. And so because of how well-known this story is, I've honestly resisted making a video about it for a very long time. I also feel like there's a lot of people out there that know more about this story than I do, although I've certainly done my best to research it for this video. However, since the early days of telling stories on my channel, I've been getting tons of comments asking for me to cover it. This is by far the most requested story that I see you guys asking for, and I'm not gonna lie, I usually try to stick with like slightly lesser known stories, but due to popular demand, well, here we are. And to be honest with you, it's actually a little bit deeper than that as well. There's a reason that this story is so popular, so well known. I mean, two young girls had their promising lives abruptly ended for no discernible reason. And so, because of that alone, I think it's worth doing my, albeit small part, in keeping this story relevant. And like I said in the intro, I'm gonna tell it with as little bias as I possibly can. And so with that said, let's take a trip together right now to the jungle of Panama. This trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. In the spring of 2014, two young girls took a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Panama. Their names were Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, and they were both students from the Netherlands. They had apparently been planning this trip to Panama for a long time. I'm talking like 6+ months. And by the way, they intended to do more than just see the scenery and take in the local culture while they were there. Of course, those were things that they absolutely wanted to do, but they also wanted to spend some time volunteering with and teaching children as well as learning Spanish. Their trip started off on the north coast of Panama, and then after a few weeks, they made their way inland to a small mountain town called Boquete. Chris and Lisanne were planning to stay with a host family and to begin their volunteer work shortly after they arrived in Boquete. However, there must have been some sort of miscommunication, because once the girls arrived, they were told that their volunteer jobs would not be starting for another week. This obviously meant that the girls now had some extra time on their hands. And what better way to fill that time than to explore the beautiful countryside around them? With this goal in mind, the girls decided to go for a hike. In the early afternoon of April 1st, 2014, Chris and Lisanne took a taxi to the trailhead for a hike called El Pianista. By the way, pronouncing words is not my strong suit, and that's even worse for words that are in, well, not English. And so I apologize if I butcher some of the names of the Spanish stuff in this video. So on this hike, they apparently brought with them a dog from the local village, and it's unclear to me exactly like who this dog belonged to, or even why the dog was with them for that matter. And so I'm sure there's people watching this video that know a lot about this story, and so if you know who the dog belonged to, then leave a comment. The only reason I mention it is because it is going to play an important role in the beginning of this mystery. I did read one source that stated the dog belonged to the host family that the girls were staying with, and then another source said that the dog belonged to like the owner of a local restaurant, so I'm not really sure, but either way, they had a local dog with them on this hike. Chris was 21 years old, and Lisanne was 22 years old. Now, both women were definitely fit, but I'm not sure that either one of them were experienced hikers. I've never been to the Netherlands, but my understanding is that it's very flat. At least that's what one of my friends from there told me. And it's certainly not comparable to the rugged terrain that the girls were setting off in on this hike. The trail that they were on, it's not a long one per se. I guess it's only about 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers each way, but it is pretty steep, and it's the jungle after all, so it's very wet. The trail gains roughly 2,000 feet or around 600 meters over the course of the climb, which is no joke, especially in such a short distance. However, despite the difficulty that I'm hyping this trail up with, the girls apparently made it to the top with pretty much no issue. They summited around 1 p.m., and they must have been really enjoying themselves. And the reason I say that is because, for an unknown reason, they actually continued on past the summit instead of turning around and hiking back down to the trailhead. This is an incredibly significant detail, and to be honest, it's possibly the reason for this entire mystery in the first place. You see, this hike that they were on is designed as an out and back, with the turnaround point being the summit that the girls reached. My understanding is that almost everybody who does this hike turns around at this point, and I'm not even sure if there is like an official trail that runs beyond the summit. I've never hiked in Panama. I've never even been to Panama. I'd love to go, by the way, if any of you watching are from Panama. But I'm willing to bet that there were probably some smaller herd paths, we call them, these unofficial, unmaintained trails that branched off beyond the turnaround points. And I did read a few sources that speculated about this being the case as well. So it's possible that the girls followed one of these herd paths beyond the summit, and it's not really clear to me why they did this, but for whatever reason, they most likely did. And this resulted in them never being seen alive ever again. So later in the day, on April 1st, this dog that I told you about, the dog that they were hiking with, well, it returned back to its owner's property without the girls. They were nowhere to be found, and the following day, they had actually made an appointment with a local guide to go explore somewhere else, and well, they didn't show up for this appointment, and this made their host family very concerned. The girls were reported missing, and then on April 3rd, a local group of searchers set out to try and find them. And by the way, from everything that I've gathered, this initial search was pretty legit. It wasn't just like a few people hiking up and down the trail looking for them or whatever. I mean, this was a proper search. They had helicopters, they had dog teams, and of course they had like organized ground searchers as well. However, despite this effort, the girls could not be located. And it wasn't long before their parents were taking an impromptu and probably very nerve-wracking plane ride to Panama. Joining them, by the way, were detectives from the girls' home country of the Netherlands. This meant that the search for Chris and Lisanne, which was already very serious, well, it was now about to get ramped up to a whole new level. But even with the families now on the ground, on location, putting pressure on the searchers to find these missing women, no results were yielded. Day after day went by where the families of Chris and Lisanne were told that their daughters had not been found and that they were still missing. These days quickly turned into weeks, and eventually the local authorities in Panama began to halt their search efforts. A lot of time went by here, folks. I'm talking 10 whole weeks went by with no answers. But then, just when everyone was starting to lose hope, as much as I hate to say it, a local woman made a bombshell discovery. She found a backpack. She found this backpack in a rice paddy near the banks of a river. This river was near the village of Alta Romero. Again, I probably said that wrong. I apologize. And it was some 5 miles away from where the girls had been hiking. This local woman finds the backpack, and then once authorities inspected the contents of the backpack, it was immediately clear that it belonged to Chris and Lisanne. The backpack contained roughly $80 in cash. It contained Lisanne's passport, 2 bras, some sunglasses, a water bottle, 2 cell phones, and of course, a Canon digital camera. And one thing that's interesting to note is that despite being outside near the river for weeks, even potentially having floated down the river, the backpack and its contents were all dry, which was a little bit suspicious. But regardless of that, investigators now had this backpack and its contents, and they quickly turned their attention to the cell phones and, of course, the camera, hoping that these items would give some clues into the fates of the missing girls. So the files and the data on these electronic devices is so important to this case, and so I'm actually going to break them down separately. We're going to start with the cell phones here. So Chris Kremers carried an iPhone 4 and Lisanne Froon carried a Samsung Galaxy S3. Activity from both of these cell phones shows that between 4:40 and 5 p.m. on April 1st, which is again the day that the women disappeared, calls to the number 112 were made. Now, if you're American like me, you might not know the significance of this number, but my European, my Asian, and other international viewers will know that 112 is used to connect to the emergency line, aka it's the same thing as dialing 911. Oh, and by the way, speaking of dialing 911, the girls also tried to call this number as well. Multiple call attempts to 112 and 911 were made between the evening of April 1st and the morning of April 3rd. But unfortunately, due to the remoteness of the area that the girls were hiking in, none of these calls successfully connected, and the girls were never able to actually speak with emergency dispatchers. And thus, to this day, it's unknown exactly what the girls were calling about. So the bizarre activity on the cell phones doesn't end with these emergency calls, by the way. I found a fantastic article by a blogger named Chris. I couldn't find his last name. And this Chris character did a deep dive into the data from each of the girls' phones. It's called imperfectplan.com, and I highly suggest you read it if you want even more details about the phone and the camera, and honestly, all of the details related to this case. I'll have a link to this blog in the description. You should go check it out. The girls started their hike with about 50% battery on each of their phones. Data shows that by the evening of April 1st, the girls were aware of their dwindling battery power and started to make efforts to conserve it, aka they began powering on and off their phones as needed. It appears that Lisanne's Samsung phone ran out of battery on April 4th, but Chris's iPhone battery lasted longer. It appears that the Samsung phone was left on for longer periods of time, which is probably why it ran out of battery quicker. On April 5th, so I'm talking days after the girls had disappeared, the iPhone's SIM PIN number was entered correctly on the phone for the last time. And I say for the last time, by the way, because there were numerous times over the next few days where the iPhone was powered on, but then the SIM number either wasn't entered correctly or it wasn't entered at all, which is very strange. And it's a big point of speculation in this case. Now, there was no activity on either phone on April 7th, April 8th, or April 9th. But then on April 10th, there was an attempt to power on that Galaxy phone, but the battery was so low at this point that the attempt registered in the phone's log, but it failed to actually power on the phone. And then the next day on April 11th, the iPhone was powered on for just over an hour, but once again, the SIM pin was either not entered or it was entered incorrectly. Like I just said there, the activity from Chris and Lisanne's phones has been a major factor in this case. It's led to tons of speculation about what happened to them, and a lot of people are asking if it was possible that somebody else besides the girls was attempting to use their phones, particularly after April 6th. Now, with that said, I told you that I would stick to the facts, and so I won't speculate anymore right now, but you got to admit, that definitely makes you wonder. Once again, go read the article I linked in the description for even more details about the cell phone data. There's charts and all this stuff. It's really cool. So now let's move on to the digital camera that was found in the girl's backpack. And to be honest with you, this camera is probably the reason I'm making this video right now, because the images on it are so mysterious and frankly disturbing that I believe it's the main reason that this story went so viral in the first place. It makes sense, right? It's one thing to hear a story, but when you can actually see images from it, especially images that are just surrounded in mystery, well, it sticks out and it just makes you wonder. So inside the girl's backpack, investigators found a Canon PowerShot camera, and it apparently belonged to Lisanne. The camera had over 100 images on it, but my understanding is that only about half of the photos are available to the public right now. I don't even think that any of the photos were ever officially released. I'm pretty sure they were actually leaked, so who knows what these other unseen photos actually contain. The first series of photos that are relevant to this case were taken on April 1st, and they just show the girls enjoying their hike. This photo right here is one of the last photos taken during the day, and was likely taken shortly before something went terribly wrong for the girls. It's one of those photos that looks pretty normal without any context, but is actually pretty disturbing once you understand the circumstances of when it was taken. The photos get even more disturbing once nighttime rolls around. There were like 90 to 100 nighttime photos taken over a 3-hour period on April 8th. So a good week after the girls disappeared. My understanding is that none of these photos, except for this one right here, actually show the girls. This one in particular is presumed to show Chris Kremer's hair, possibly with like some blood in it. The context for this photo, and the rest of the nighttime photos for that matter, it's not really known. And I'm not even gonna try to speculate what's going on here. If you are interested in that speculation, well, there's tons of Reddit threads, articles, and even videos that attempt to explain what you're looking at right now. The rest of the photos look pretty much like this. They show various natural features, the sky, and many of them were taken with the camera's flash illuminating the immediate area beyond the camera. This has led some people to suggest that the girls may have been using the flash to either, I don't know, signal for help or to even see what was in front of them. It's also been speculated that, much like the cell phones, perhaps somebody else besides the girls took all of these nighttime photos. Again, I told you I wouldn't speculate, that I would stick to the facts here, and so I'll leave that where it be. But there is a very puzzling fact about the series of photos that I haven't told you about yet. There was one photo number 509, that was missing from the series of photos on the camera. So this Canon camera numbered each photo in consecutive order. And so photo number 508 was the last photo taken by the girls in the daylight. The next photo on the camera was photo number 510. And by the way, photo number 510 was the first of that disturbing sequence of nighttime photos taken a week after the girls disappeared. Photo number 509 did not exist. And even more perplexing was that there was literally zero sign of its data anywhere on the memory card. I am not a technical expert, but from what I understand, even if a photo was intentionally deleted from the camera, there would still be some sort of evidence of it on the memory card. Many experts have come out and said that it would be very unlikely for the camera to have mistakenly skipped a number in the naming sequence, which leaves us to wonder if the camera may have been connected to a computer in order to erase that specific photo number 509. I have no idea who would have done this or why it would have been done. All we know is that something is weird about that missing photo. Something just doesn't really add up there. So after the backpack was discovered, search efforts were renewed by investigators, and of course they zeroed in on the general location where the backpack was found. Some time passed, a few weeks I believe, but eventually these efforts would end up paying off big time when the partial remains of Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were finally found. Investigators found Lisanne's left foot intact inside of her hiking boot. They continued searching the area and eventually recovered over 30 bones. And of course, DNA testing soon proved that the bones belonged to not just Lisanne, but both girls. However, the strangeness of this story doesn't stop here. It's been reported that some of Lisanne's remains still had, this is kind of gross, but little bits of flesh attached, and yet Chris Kremer's bones were clean and looked as if they had been bleached. No one has been able to definitively explain this inconsistency, though of course there's plenty of speculation about it. And by the way, no one has been able to determine what caused the girls' deaths either. I even found one source that stated there were bones from other individuals found with the bones of Kremers and Froon. And of course, if that's true, then it would definitely point towards foul play being the cause of their death, though I would take this with a grain of salt because most of the other sources I read didn't mention this, so it might be true, it might not be, I'm not really sure, and I don't want to BS you guys, so if you know more about this, please let me know in the comments. And with all that said, those are pretty much the basic facts of this case as I understand them. And once again, this story has been covered countless times in other YouTube videos and podcasts and books and just about every single content medium out there. And so if you want a deeper dive into this case, you have plenty of options available. But now that I've laid everything out there, albeit at a very high level, of course, I just want to dive in and go full speculation here, like I've been resisting so far in the video. What the hell happened to Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon? It seems to me that there are two main theories being talked about. The first of which is foul play, and then the second theory being that the girls died naturally due to an accident in the backcountry. I'm gonna break these theories down a little bit one by one, and of course, I'll let you decide which one makes the most sense. I feel like in a lot of missing hiker cases, foul play is assumed when the evidence doesn't always support it. In this case, however, foul play is absolutely plausible. There's just a lot of things that don't really make sense with the camera, with the bones that were found, and also with the cell phone activity. In my opinion, the most damning pieces of evidence that point to foul play are the photo number 509 that appears to have been purposely deleted, and then the girl's bones being found in different stages of decay. However, there's even more evidence of foul play that I haven't really touched on yet, though my understanding is that much of this is speculation and rumor. It's not proven fact necessarily, and that's the reason why I didn't include it when I was telling you the facts of the story. But I will mention now that some people have suggested that the girl's backpack may have been planted sometime after they disappeared. And I will admit that it's a little strange that it took 10 weeks for the backpack to be found, and I say that because, well, during that 10 weeks, there was intense searching going on for the girls. Of course, the backpack was found in a different location than the actual hiking trail they disappeared from, but it's still relatively close, like 5 miles away. So I don't know, I feel like it probably would have been found. I also mentioned earlier that despite the backpack being found next to a river, well, it was dry, and so were its contents. That's how I understand it. And I don't know, the camera and the phones, they were still working, which I find a little bit strange because if they had been floating downstream for some time, again, I'm not an expert on this, but you'd think that the electronics would have been like fried or broken. And another strange piece of information that I have not yet mentioned is that the last person known to have seen the girls alive, which was the taxi driver that dropped them off at the trailhead on April 1st, well, he ended up dying under suspicious circumstances less than a year after the girls went missing. And I will say, I guess it's worth mentioning this, but it's probably just a coincidence. I don't know. And I'm certainly not suggesting that this guy was involved with the girls' disappearances at all, but this 34-year-old gentleman, Leonardo Gonzalez, well, he died in an apparent drowning in March of 2015 while he was waiting to shuttle a group of tourists back from a river. Again, you can make of that what you will. It's been scrutinized a ton online, and so who knows if that's related or not, you know, I don't know. But of course, all of the things I just told you about, all this stuff may suggest foul play resulted in the girls' deaths, but it doesn't suggest who was responsible. And I think that's a big deal because it's hard to say that the girls were like definitively murdered when there isn't a clear party that is responsible for it. And besides, I mean, accidents in the backcountry happen. People get lost, especially when they're in unfamiliar terrain, as these girls were, and people die as a result of this. And so with that said, if you go on any online forums discussing this case, you're gonna realize pretty quickly that there are a lot of people who dismiss foul play in this story, and a lot of people that believe the girls died an accidental death. And despite some of the suspicious evidence and circumstances in this story, I do think that there's merit to the accidental death argument. After all, they were hiking in some pretty gnarly terrain. I mean, the jungle is not a place to mess around, and so perhaps they made a bad choice to continue further down the unofficial trail past the summit where most people turn around, and then they got lost and eventually fell or just died from exposure. Maybe somebody found the backpack a short time later, took it home, not really realizing its significance, and then they saw the news about the case and they were like, oh, I don't want to be associated with this backpack, and so they just left it on the river hoping that somebody else would find it. Maybe the camera did actually malfunction, thus skipping photo number 509, and maybe the girls took those mysterious night photos in order to illuminate the forest for navigation purposes or to signal rescuers. Or maybe none of that happened. Maybe there is some other theory that I didn't even touch on in this video that I'm not even aware of. I mean, the truth about the disappearances and the deaths of Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon is that we just don't know what happened. There are people out there that swear they have this case figured out, and I'm not even suggesting that they're wrong, but all I'm saying is that we, the general public, we just don't know. That is the cold hard truth, despite all the speculation, despite all the theories and deep dives, and despite all the podcasts and YouTube videos. I wish I had a more interesting conclusion to share with all of you, but I'm never going to be that guy that lies, misleads, or exaggerates in order to get views and make a more interesting video. The truth is, we just don't know. Let me know what you think happened in the comments. And if you have any content suggestions for those that want even more details about this case, well, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 3 photos that were taken by hikers just moments before disaster struck. A few of these photos look normal at first glance until you learn what happened after the camera was clicked. And honestly, some of the other photos look just straight up disturbing to begin with. And then when you learn the story behind them, well, they just get taken to a whole new level. So with that said, I'm now going to take you on a virtual trip to the beautiful mountains of Colorado, one of my favorite states to visit. Now, this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission on this trip, especially if you're a repeat viewer. Okay, let's do it. These photos show the last moments of Dr. Toni Henthorn's life. Literally just minutes after these photos were taken, she would end up falling to her death 130 feet off of a cliff. And as if that wasn't disturbing enough, by the way, her fall, well, it was no accident. In September of 2012, Toni Henthorn and her husband, Harold Henthorn, they took a trip to Rocky Mountain National Park to celebrate their 12th anniversary as a couple. On September 29th, they decided to go for a short hike up Deer Mountain, which was supposedly chosen by Harold himself. Now, I read a report stating that Toni had like bad knees or something and wouldn't have had like the physical strength to complete a difficult hike, but regardless of this, that is exactly what the couple would end up doing. By all accounts that we have, at least, the hike started off fairly normally. I mean, they were just going along, and they even ended up taking these photos together. You know, they're smiling, they're looking just about as normal and wholesome as could be. But of course, as I've established here, this was not gonna be a normal hike. In fact, Harold Henthorn wasn't even a normal husband, and you'll understand what I mean by that in just a second. That very same afternoon, Toni's brother received a text from Harold that immediately sent chills up his spine. This text read, quote, "Barry, urgent. Toni is injured in Estes Park, fall from rock." Which, can you imagine getting that text about your sister from your sister's husband? That's pretty brutal, obviously, but the follow-up text that Harold sent was even worse. He sent a very disturbing text that read, quote, "She's gone." I use the word disturbing a lot in my videos, but I don't use it lightly, folks. That's a very disturbing text, and the rest of this story, as you can probably tell, is also very disturbing. So Toni and Harold are on their hike, and at some point along the way, Toni unfortunately fell off a cliff. And so after this happened, Harold did what hopefully anybody in this situation would do, and he called 911.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Hello, my name is Harold Henthorne. I'm in the Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay.
I need an Alpine mountain rescue team immediately.
Okay, what is your exact location?
My exact location is Deer Mountain, North Summit, about 1 mile south of the visitor center.
Okay, I'm going to transfer you to the park, so hang on the line. You're going to hear some clicking, and right now I'm pulling up your lat and your long on my phone here. Let me try it one more time before I transfer you.
National Park. I'm sorry, where's your emergency? This is Estes, and we have a gentleman on Deer Mountain. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My wife has fallen from a rock on the north summit of Deer Mountain, on the Deer Mountain Trail, and she's in really critical condition. She's had a bad fall.
How far did she fall, sir?
30, 40 feet, 30 feet.
30, 40 feet?
I think 30 feet.
30 feet. Are you with
I
her
can't
now?
be sure. I am. Let me be sure that you know my location first. We have really bad cell coverage.
And tell me some things about the patient.
She is a white female, 50 years old, great health. She has respiration approximately 5 to 8 beats a minute. Her pulse is about between 60 and 80 beats a minute.
Okay, what's your main injury?
Head injury.
Head injury.
Concussion.
Okay, any other injuries?
To be internal,
Is she conscious and breathing?
No, she's not. She has not been conscious. She is breathing. She's anywhere between 5 and 8 beats a minute now.
Okay, hold on just a second.
Okay. Here's the thing. I will pay any and all expenses for a helicopter. I don't care if it's private. I don't care if it's commercial. It wouldn't matter if it's medevac. I'll pay any and all expenses right now.
Okay.
Have you drop a paramedic down here?
So on the surface, Harold sounds caring and determined to save his wife. I mean, he even told the dispatcher that he would happily pay whatever cost it took to send a helicopter out there to the scene as soon as possible. But with that said, when the police analyzed this 911 call, that's not the conclusion that they came to. They came to a very different one, we'll say. Now, while Harold Henthorne was saying all the right things on this call, his tone just didn't sound quite right. It almost seemed as though he had practiced the call beforehand. He sounded just cold and he sounded calculated. And this was certainly a red flag for the police, but things got even worse when they listened to the part of the call where Harold was supposedly trying to give his wife CPR. Harold told 911 that he did know how to perform CPR, but according to the police's interpretation of the call, it didn't really seem like he was trying very hard to save his wife. The dispatcher also tried to help coach him through the process, but of course that didn't work. And it was actually later revealed that the texts that Harold sent to his brother were sent at the same time that he was supposed to be performing the CPR on his wife. So it definitely seemed like something fishy was going on, and this suspicion would end up rising to whole new heights when investigators searched Harold Henthorne's car. Inside of his car, they found a trail map of the area around Deer Mountain, which was obviously where they were hiking, with the Deer Mountain Trail in particular highlighted in pink, which is normal enough, right? I mean, maybe it's a little bit odd that the hikers left the map behind instead of taking it with them on the trail, but still nothing out of the ordinary there, I guess. I mean, I've probably highlighted routes on maps before. What was out of the ordinary, however, was the fact that the exact rock outcropping that Tony had fallen from was marked on the map with an X. Again, my understanding here is that the map was left in the car before the couple started their hike, which meant that Harold had marked that spot prior to his wife falling, not afterwards, which is obviously very suspicious, right? So that was another red flag, and the suspicion did not stop there, by the way. Investigators start looking through the photos that the couple took on their hike before Tony fell. I mean, these are her last photos after all. And they noticed this one in particular. Tony is pictured here looking through a pair of binoculars, which would have presumably been recovered from the scene of her death. However, investigators have asserted that they couldn't find these binoculars, which is a little bit bizarre, isn't it? Still though, while all this evidence I've discussed so far is, it's bizarre and even suspicious, it's still far from proof that Harold intentionally pushed his wife off the cliff, right? Obviously, you need more proof in a case like this, but the bizarreness and the suspicion doesn't stop here either. When investigators started digging into Harold's background, the case was instantly taken to a whole new level because, as it turns out, Toni Henthorn was not the first wife of Harold's to die under suspicious circumstances. In 1995, Harold and his first wife, named Sandra Lynn Henthorn, got a flat tire on their Jeep when they were driving on a remote Colorado road. Allegedly, Harold and Sandra had stopped to change a flat tire or something like that when Sandra accidentally dropped a lug nut underneath the Jeep. And so she goes down to try to retrieve it. She's kind of underneath the Jeep. And when that happened, the Jeep somehow fell off of the jack and it crushed her to death. This accident was briefly investigated, it sounds like, but it was ultimately ruled an accident. And this conveniently allowed Harold to collect $300,000 from a life insurance payment, which he allegedly used to just live off of basically for many years afterwards. And to kind of bring this full circle, as he did in that case with his first wife, Harold had in fact taken out life insurance policies on his second wife. These ones, by the way, to a tune of some $4.5 million. There was also some other sketchy stuff in his past. He had apparently lied about being employed, lied about starting various companies. And again, this is all just alleged, I guess. We don't know for sure, but apparently he hadn't worked a real job in years. When investigators began questioning Harold about the accident with Toni, they quickly caught him changing his story. In fact, between what he told investigators and what he told Toni's brother, Harold produced at least 4 different versions of events from that fateful day when Toni was killed. So, yeah, it's not good, folks. And in case you're still not convinced, in 2011, roughly a year or so before her tragic accident, Toni was seriously injured when a piece of plywood that her and Harold were moving accidentally fell on her. It's now suspected that this was not an accident at all, but rather Harold's first attempt at killing his wife Toni in order to cash out on her life insurance policy. Harold Henthorn had no good explanation for why he marked that location of Toni's fall on the map prior to her actually falling, and ultimately, in 2015, he was convicted for murdering Toni Henthorn and sentenced to life in prison. These photos that the couple took together just moments before Toni died will remain a haunting reminder that even though a couple and a relationship looks normal and happy in a photo, that does not mean that disaster and evil aren't possible, even if it is obviously extremely rare. So the photos of Toni and Harold Henthorn did indeed look quite normal, but that is not the case for the last photo of the next hiker I'm going to be telling you about. This photo, taken in 1991, is the last photo of 12-year-old Jared Negretti. And nearly 33 years after this photo was taken, he is still nowhere to be found. On July 19th, 1991, a Boy Scout troop based in Southern California went on an overnight backpacking trip in the area around San Gorgonio Mountain. One of the troop's members was a 12-year-old boy named Jared Negretti. He was in 8th grade at the time, and he was from El Monte, California, and this was apparently the first time that he would ever spend the night in the backcountry. So in addition to him, there were 5 other scouts in the troop, and also, of course, an adult leader, the chaperone, I guess you could say. And so they're climbing up this mountain, and by 6 p.m. that evening, the group was almost at the very top, but apparently Jared had fallen behind a little bit on the climb up. And this wasn't too concerning initially, but it did catch the attention of another group of hikers who actually informed the troop leader about him kind of lagging behind. Apparently this group of hikers had noticed Jared cutting switchbacks on his way up the mountain and had instructed him not to do this because it's bad trail etiquette. Now, when these hikers informed the troop leader of Jared's location, the troop leader decided that he would just stay put for the time being and then link back up with Jared on the way back down the mountain. I mean, he probably figured that Jared couldn't have been that far away. Like, right? Like, come on, how far could he be? I'm just gonna say this was a decision that the troop leader would soon come to regret, because once the Boy Scout troop started to descend the mountain, they quickly realized that Jared was nowhere to be found. So this is a pretty famous case. It's also, you know, somewhat old too, early 90s. And so it's been scrutinized to death. And so I don't know. I just don't want to spend that long criticizing the troop leader for this Boy Scout group. But at the same time, I've done enough of these videos to know what a lot of you guys are going to be talking about in the comments and pointing out in the comments. And so I will just say, leaving a 12-year-old boy or any member of your group that you're like the leader of, that you're chaperoning behind, that is just incredibly irresponsible. And I'm also sure that the troop leader regrets his actions that day. I mean, it was just a big mistake. Jared was obviously a little bit slower of a hiker than everybody else. And so what they probably should have done was had him actually in front. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you could put him in the middle, just not in the back, because when you do that, that's when people get left behind. And I also understand, I'm sure it's not easy at all to like oversee a group of young boys like this out in the woods, especially by yourself with no other help from another adult. But like, I don't know, I had to mention that. So realizing the gravity of the situation when they couldn't find Jared, the troop wasted no time reporting him missing. They were planning on camping somewhere in the backcountry on their way back down the mountain, but instead of doing that, they actually all hiked out in the pitch dark so that they could go get some help. Authorities wasted no time getting out and searching for Jared, and they also began to take stock of the items that he was known to have been carrying at the time of his disappearance. Now again, he was out there for an overnight backcountry trip, and so they knew that Jared had some like limited camping gear, he had some snacks, and he also had a 2-quart water bottle. They also knew that the weather and the temperatures at that time were pretty mild, thankfully. And I'm sure that was very encouraging, because even with the like limited amount of camping gear that Jared had, they knew that if they could find him quickly, he would probably be okay. I mean, he wasn't gonna freeze to death, and there was also plenty of water in the area apparently, and so they didn't fear that he would die of dehydration. And so they're out there looking for him, and you know, they must have been feeling somewhat optimistic, although obviously it's a very scary situation. And I imagine that this optimism would have grown because very early on into the search, investigators found some, I'll just say, important clues that signaled that they were on the right track. They found some footprints on the ground that matched the shoes that Jared was known to have been wearing during his disappearance. Now, they also found some snack wrappers, and they even found Jared's film camera. Perhaps there were some photos on this camera that they could use to like pinpoint his location, or at the very least, you know, kind of indicate where he was planning on heading. So they obviously took this roll of film and got it developed immediately, and this revealed that Jared had taken 12 photos. 11 of these photos were just, you know, shots of the scenery, right? Presumably taken actually before he even went missing. However, the last photo on the roll of film was much different. When investigators saw this last photo, I can only imagine that it probably sent chills straight up their spine. This was the last photo on the film roll. It's a close-up selfie of Jared's face, and it's assumed that this photo was taken at night. The flash had gone off in the photo, so at the very least, the lighting must have been low wherever he took it. And also, I guess I should mention here, this disturbing photo would turn out to be Jared's last photo. And it also, unfortunately, provided no additional clues into his location. Investigators believe that Jared had like slid down the mountain, possibly to reach a river that was situated down below. And during this slide, he may have lost the camera and the food wrappers, or he maybe just left them on the ground accidentally. Once again, this was a valuable clue, and so searchers like zeroed in on this area where the items were found, and they spent weeks searching. Thousands of individuals joined the search, in addition to helicopters and searchers on horseback. They had this huge effort, and despite all of it, no sign of Jared was found ever again. And that's basically, that is exactly, I should say, where this case stands today. So I'm gonna ask, what the hell could have happened to Jared Negretti? There has been a number of theories that have been floated around over the years, but none of these theories seem to have any, like, strong evidence behind them, I'll say. At least not that I'm aware of. People have speculated that Jared may have been attacked by an animal or something, or fallen down the mountain. And yes, of course, the theory of foul play has been tossed around as well. Now, I'm not in the business of solving the stories that I talk about or the cases I talk about. I just try to tell the stories, and so my personal opinion on, what I think happened doesn't really mean much. I'm sure most of you understand that. But I will say a lot of the time when I cover these stories, I kind of have some leading theory that I think is most likely. Again, for what little that's worth. But I just want to say with this one, I really don't know. There's just such a lack of evidence, and so I don't know. What do you guys think about what happened here? Leave your comments and let me know. And of course, please keep Jared and his family in your hearts. You never know, but I feel like we likely won't ever know the full story behind his disturbing last photo. But for our next story, quite the opposite is true. For this story, we know exactly what happened, and the details are incredibly bizarre and incredibly haunting. In 2014, a group of 6 Rutgers University students were hiking in the Alps Preserve in West Milford, New Jersey. They're hiking along, and while they were doing this, they experienced a literal worst-case scenario on the trail. Now, I want to say that New Jersey is like the most densely populated state in all of the United States, and so it's not exactly the kind of place where you would expect to encounter a dangerous wild animal, right? But with that said, there definitely are bears in New Jersey, black bears in particular. And while the group of students were hiking along, they realized that one of these bears was hot on their tails. 22-year-old Darsh Patel began snapping photos of the bear, and in each one of these photos, it showed the 300-pound bear, I mean, this is a massive bear, getting closer and closer to the hiker's location. After these photos were taken, the bear got even closer to them, and realizing the danger that they were in, they all fled into different directions. For whatever reason, just dumb luck, or lack of luck, I should say, Patel was the hiker that the bear zeroed in on, and he reportedly ran up a rock formation with the bear like right behind him. He yelled out to his friends, telling them to just continue running, and then tragically, he was never seen alive ever again. The rest of Patel's friends were unharmed, and so they regrouped eventually, and they called the police, and hiked out of the woods, obviously. The police were immediately dispatched, and within just a few short hours, they found Patel's body, and they also found the bear that had killed him. This bear was still circling around his body as if it was protecting it as a food source. I mean, just incredibly disturbing. Police tried to scare the bear off, but this bear would not give up, and so eventually they shot the bear dead. So this is obviously extremely scary, and it's also extremely rare, and I actually want to illustrate to you just how rare this is. I did some Googling around and some research about this, and I'm pretty confident that to this day, Darsh Patel is the only person to ever die from a bear attack in the state of New Jersey, at least since records have been kept of this kind of thing. There have been other attacks, to be clear, but I don't believe that anyone else has ever died. Bear attacks are just so rare in general, but black bear attacks are even more rare, is my understanding. There are a lot more black bears in the United States than, say, grizzly bears, and so the raw number of attacks might be higher for black bears, but grizzly bears are known to be more aggressive than black bears. Still extremely rare to have any issues with those either. But I don't know, I'm just trying to illustrate that with a black bear, this event is so uncommon that Patel basically died in an event that is literally 1 in a million chances. But still, if this event is so rare, it happened. And so the obvious question is, why? Why did it happen? And the first story that I had when I learned about this story was, if the group of hikers was behaving like irresponsibly in any way. Like, were they getting too close to the bear intentionally? Were they messing with it? Were they doing anything like that? I couldn't find a ton of information on this story, to be honest, but I will say that I did not read any reports indicating that the group could have been at fault in any way. And I feel like if they did something wrong like this, if they had, like, you know, been messing with the bear or being irresponsible, basically, I feel like the authorities would have specified that, you know, as a warning and lesson to other hikers. It seems like this particular bear was just hungry, and that's strange because black bears almost never view humans as a potential food source, but on extremely rare occasions, I guess, these predatory attacks can happen, and unfortunately, that's just what happened in this tragic case. I also want to note, you know, I'm not a bear expert, obviously, you could probably tell that by now, but I do know that you're not supposed to run away from bears that are behaving aggressively towards you, because this can, like, trigger their chasing instincts. This particular group did run away from the bear, and so it's possible that Patel may have survived if they had all kind of stuck together and yelled and thrown rocks and stuff at the bear. But with that said, I also can't blame anyone for wanting to just book it when they're confronted with such a dangerous situation. It's very sad, and my heart goes out to Darsh Patel, his friends, his family, and of course those other friends and students that he was there with that fateful day. Even though search and rescue wasn't involved in this story, at least that I could find, for this video's call out, I want to encourage you to check out the volunteer, emphasis on the volunteer, nonprofit group called New Jersey Search and Rescue. They work to keep people safe in the state's backcountry, and once again, they're all unpaid volunteers doing this exhausting and dangerous work entirely for free. I love giving back to these organizations, and so I've made a donation to them, and I encourage you to do the same, even if it's just a few bucks. It doesn't have to be a lot. I'll have their website in the description. August 8th, 1999. This was a day that Park Ranger Lance Matson would never forget for the rest of his life. The heat was absolutely scorching in New Mexico's Carlsbad Caverns National Park, and in the early afternoon, Ranger Matson realized that a pair of hikers were long overdue. Now, it's not uncommon for hikers to get lost in national parks. Most of the time, they're found alive and well and go on to make a full recovery. But on rare occasions, well, they pass away during their ordeal, often due to heat exhaustion or dehydration. Ranger Matson probably assumed that one of those two scenarios would play out in front of him once he located these missing hikers. But much to his surprise, and also to his horror, the situation was much, much more complicated. So complicated, in fact, that he couldn't have even made it up if he had tried. Ranger Matson spotted a tent off in the distance, and he approached it, hoping that the two hikers were inside of it and alive. He was even met with some relief when Rafi Kodakian popped his head out of the tent and begged for water. But this relief was quickly crushed at the answer to one simple question that Ranger Matson asked him. Referring to Rafi's hiking partner and his best friend, David Coughlin, Ranger Matson asked, quote, "Where's your buddy?" Rafi answered, quote, "I killed him." The park ranger had stumbled upon a murder scene the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. And the reason I say that is not because of how violent Rafi's actions were or anything like that, but rather because of his motive. Was it possible that by killing his best friend, Rafi Kodakian was actually doing him a favor? Buckle up, folks, because you're about to hear one of the most confusing and honestly heart-wrenching stories in the history of backpacking. Folks, this is the murder of David Coughlin. So not only is this a morbidly fascinating story, it's also a unique one among the other outdoor murder stories that I've covered on this channel. And the reason for that is because there's a what would I do factor involved with this story, if that makes sense. The line between right and wrong good and evil even, well, it's a little bit blurred. And so as I tell you this story, I want you to think objectively about what you would do if you were in this awful, awful situation. Now, I personally do think there's a pretty obvious right and wrong way to handle things here, but I'm gonna do my best to save my opinions for later in the video and just tell you the facts. But with that said, as you hear this story unfold, I think that there's a pretty good chance you're going to be left with a lot of unanswered questions. I know that I certainly am, even after researching extensively for this video. I'll highlight the most obvious unanswered questions to me, and I also encourage you to leave your own unanswered questions in the comment section of this video. So without further ado, let's take a virtual trip to the desert of southern New Mexico. Now, I'm inviting you on this trip for free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of this channel. All right, let's go. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. On August 4th, 1999, two best friends arrived at Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Their names were David Coughlin and Rafi Kodakian, and they were in the middle of this cross-country road trip that was supposed to take them from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way to Santa Barbara, California. Once they arrived there, Coughlin was supposed to start working towards his master's degree in environmental science at UC Santa Barbara. Kodakian, on the other hand, was simply just along for the ride, right? He was along for the adventure, and this was also not his first time on a cross-country road trip either. 2 years earlier, he had been working as a freelance writer, kind of part-time for the Boston Globe, and he actually published multiple articles detailing a 10-week road trip that he had taken through at least half of the states in the United States. Now, I'm not 100% sure why these two men in their 20s chose to stop at Carlsbad Caverns. I heard that maybe an uncle, a relative, had recommended it to him. If you do a quick Google Maps search, it shows that the men's route from Boston to California, Southern California, well, it would have taken them through New Mexico, but still not terribly close to where this national park is located. But then again, I don't even know why I'm speculating about this. They were on a road trip after all. The journey was the purpose here. They weren't just focused on the end destination. And so ultimately, on August 4th, they spoke with a park ranger, they filled out their overnight camping permit, and then they drove their car to the trailhead for the now infamous Rattlesnake Canyon. Perhaps you've heard of it. Now, folks, I've never hiked in Rattlesnake Canyon before, and honestly, after hearing this story, I'm not sure that I ever want to, but my understanding is that for the unprepared hiker, it can be an extremely dangerous place. It's dry, it's windy, I mean, it's the desert after all, it's exposed, and of course, in the summer, it can be extremely hot. Now, these are all dangers that can be pretty easily mitigated, and so I'm not suggesting that any hiker or whoever takes on Rattlesnake Canyon is like walking right into a death trap. That would be dramatic and ridiculous. But for David Coughlin and Rafi Kodakian, that is exactly what they were doing when they parked their car and headed out into the canyon. Because they had been driving all day, the two men got a pretty late start on their hike. They would actually end up only hiking about 1.5 miles from their car before stopping to set up camp for the night. That next morning, their plan was to just simply backtrack to their vehicle, retrace their steps, and then, having gotten a small taste for Carlsbad Caverns National Park, continue their drive west towards California. But when the two men started hiking on the morning of August 5th, they quickly found themselves in a dire, to put it mildly, situation. They couldn't follow the trail that would lead them back to their car, lead them back to safety. They couldn't even find it for that matter. And so they found themselves hopelessly lost in the remote desert with no compass and a dwindling water supply. The pair hiked all day, trying to find the trailhead, trying to find their car, but they just couldn't do it, folks. Their water supply was almost gone at this point, and they even resorted to eating cactus fruit to try to get some sort of moisture in their mouths. This is just a desperate situation, and eventually they resigned to just spending another night in the canyon, clinging on to desperate hope that the next morning, August 6th, they would somehow find their way back. Folks, this did not happen. On August 6th, the nightmare that Coughlin and Cotahican were in only became infinitely worse. This was the day that they drank the last of their water supply, and they once again wandered around through the desert floor. They even climbed up to the rim of the canyon. You see, Cotahican had thought he saw a light, maybe like a headlamp or like car lights or something like that. He thought he saw that on the rim the previous night. And because of this, the two men hoped that, if they climbed up to this rim, if they exerted what was left of their dwindling strength, they got up there, that they would find, I don't know, some park rangers, or at the very least some other hikers, or maybe even the road that they drove in on. I wasn't there, obviously, but I can only imagine that this probably felt like their final chance at survival. But when Coughlin and Cotahican reached the top of the rim, they were greeted with nothing but miles of scorching desert beyond them. There were no rangers, there were no other hikers, and there were definitely no roads. And this is a very critical moment in this story, because we now know from reading the journals that the two men kept at the time that at this point, they pretty much knew that they were most likely going to die. And so they had no other option. They hiked back to their campsite, and this is brutal. By the time that they reached their campsite, they were just so dehydrated that they actually considered drinking their own urine. Now, from my research, I'm not sure if Coughlin was fully on board with this, but apparently Cotahican did try, and he failed, by the way. He wasn't able to even bring himself to swallow it. Now, I'm no expert on this, I promise you that, but the general scientific consensus seems to be that drinking your own urine will not actually hydrate you. It will actually have the opposite effect. And so, on the rare chance that any of you find yourself in a desperate situation like this, God forbid, don't drink your own urine. Trust me, just don't do it. When the two hikers had filled out their camping permits, they had actually been told by the people at the front desk to carry 1 gallon of water per person per day. But for whatever reason, the men pretty much straight up ignored this advice, and they only carried 3 quarts of water between the two of them. This was obviously a very bad decision that they would clearly come to regret. At this point, the men had fully come to the realization that if nobody found them, if nobody located them, they were completely and utterly screwed. Let's be honest. They would have no other choice but to suffer a drawn-out, slow death while just laying there in their tent, being able to do nothing besides jot down a few journal entries and suffer. And so at this point, the two men, they wrote down their wills. One entry from Coughlin's journal, which was actually addressed to his girlfriend, read, quote, "I am in utter agony, and I know you would understand. I've barely eaten and drank since Wednesday evening. Nobody is going to come." As nighttime was setting in the following day, both men started to become violently sick. Coughlin, in particular, was in bad shape. He was vomiting nonstop all night, probably due to how dehydrated and exhausted he was. When the sun finally rose on August 8th, it appears that Coughlin had basically had enough of the suffering and the pain. Well, at least according to Cotahican, that's what happened. Folks, the next series of events I'm about to describe to you are extremely disturbing. And they're basically what separate this story from other tales of survival and death in the wilderness that I've told you about. On the morning of August 8th, David Coughlin was in such agony that he apparently asked Rafi Cotahican, his best friend, to end his life for him. Cotahican wrote in his journal, quote, "David had been in pain all night long. At around 5 or 6, he turned to me and begged that I put my knife through his chest." And to this morbid request, Cotahican apparently obliged. He wrote, quote, "I did." and a second time when he wouldn't die. He still breathed and spoke, so I told him that I was going to cover his face. He said, okay. And then Kotahikan wrote a chilling 4-word sentence. This is what he wrote. Quote, he, referring to David, struggled but died. Now, this next final sentence of Kotahikan's journal entry seems to indicate that he knew at least somewhat of the moral implications of what he had just done to his best friend. He wrote, quote, God, his family, mine, please forgive me. And so just like that, David Coughlin, well, he was dead. A few hours after the supposed mercy killing of Coughlin took place, Park Ranger Lance Matson was surveying the trailhead where the two men had parked their car. Ranger Matson realized that Coughlin and Kotahikan's camping permit was supposed to have had them leaving the park like 3 days earlier, and thus something must have gone wrong. And so Matson set off down into Rattlesnake Canyon, which, launched the start of the search for the two lost hikers. And pretty quickly, actually, he spotted their tent, just a little bit off in the distance, which is a testament to how close the two lost hikers actually were to their car. As the ranger approached the tent, he would have had no idea that he was about to stumble right into a mystery that people would speculate over for literally years to come. So just before he reached the tent, Rafi Kotahikan, clearly in bad shape, actually appeared out of it and said, quote, please tell me you have water. Ranger Matson, obviously prepared, did in fact have extra water, and he handed Kotahikan a bottle. Kotahikan then chugged this water like a frat boy chugging a beer at a party, apparently, and then, in similar fashion actually to how the frat boy situation might play out, he immediately vomited all over the desert floor. I guess this is kind of to be expected due to how dehydrated Kotahikan was. The ranger actually advised him to kind of go easy on the water, so that he could hold it down. And then the ranger asked him, quote, where's your buddy? In response to this, Kotahikan directed Ranger Matson to a pile of rocks that was sitting just a few feet away from the tent. The ranger was confused initially, but Kotahikan's next eerie sentence explained everything. Pointing to the rocks, Kotahikan said, quote, I killed him. David Coughlin's lifeless body was located underneath the rocks, which Kotahikan had apparently covered him with. And so this all unfolds, and as Kotahikan was being airlifted to the hospital, investigators began the very confusing task of piecing together what the hell had just happened. Now, listening to this story as I've told it so far, things might seem pretty straightforward, albeit a bit morally questionable, of course. But as investigators studied the scene and they put together the lost hikers' timeline, and they also poured through each of their journals, many questions started to emerge. Was this truly a mercy killing? And if it was, how on earth did it get to that point in the first place? Now, I won't speculate any longer about the questions that investigators may have had, and instead, I'm going to share with you the questions that I have, and I have a lot of them, by the way. So many, in fact, that I'm going to be spending a good amount of time in this video simply just pointing out how things in this story just don't seem to add up. And to be clear, I'm not saying that every single one of these unanswered questions can be attributed to malice. In fact, I'm sure that many of them were just due to negligence and bad decision making. But still, I'm just confused about what the hell happened during Coughlin and Kotahikan's nightmare in Rattlesnake Canyon. So my first question is perhaps the easiest to answer, but it's so glaringly obvious that I just have to ask it. Why the hell did the men carry such little water with them when they went into the canyon? Again, when they filled out their camping permits, they were told point blank that they needed to carry far more than just 3 quarts of water. And yes, of course, they were only planning on camping for that one night, not the 3 nights that they actually ended up spending out there. But still, this just seems like such an obvious mistake that I had to mention it. Why did they carry such little water? And maybe I have an answer to this. I probably do. I think it can be pretty clearly attributed to just ignorance. I mean, they just made a bad choice, ignoring the Rangers' water recommendations. And my next question can probably be answered by the very same reasoning, for that matter. How the hell did the men spend 2 days wandering around the desert and not find the trail to their car or even the car itself? According to one source I found, Coughlin and Cotahican's campsite was on a side trail that was marked with rock cairns, which led some 250 feet back to the main trail. And then this main trail was only about a mile to a mile and a half away from their parked car. Don't get me wrong, I can understand it being a little confusing. I mean, maybe they couldn't find the trail immediately, or maybe it just like wasn't that obvious or something like that. But with the amount of time that they spent searching for a way back to their car, it just doesn't make sense to me how they didn't find it eventually. It wasn't like they were miles and miles away from any established trail. I mean, they were so close to the trail and to their car. But then again, I don't think either one of these men were like super experienced hikers. And so that, coupled with the confusion and the panic that dehydration brings, provides a at least somewhat plausible explanation for why they couldn't find their way back, I guess. And so we'll move on. My next unanswered question is one that I don't see many other people asking about this story, actually. And I will admit there's probably a good explanation for this, and I just don't know it due to lack of information. But I still have to ask, how come it took so long for the Rangers to realize that the men were missing? And let me be clear here, I'm not blaming the Rangers for this situation. I'm a firm believer that when you go into the backcountry, you and only you are responsible for your safety. It's not anyone else's responsibility, but it just seems strange that the Rangers knew the two men were only supposed to be camping for one night, and yet it took 3 more days essentially before anyone realized that they were missing, that they were overdue. Again, I could be not getting something here, and so if you have an explanation for this, please leave it in the comments. But I don't know, I couldn't quite shake this question when I was researching for this story. All right, so now let's get into some of the more disturbing, you could say, unanswered questions. And I know I use that word a lot in my videos. I've already used it probably like 7 times in this one, but I don't know, I just can't think of a more fitting description for what I'm about to tell you. And I think you're gonna understand why I say that as I give you some of the details about what investigators uncovered after Cotahican was rescued. When Rafi Cotahican was brought to the hospital, it was clear that he was severely dehydrated. However, as was noted by Ranger Matson, he was all there, if you know what I mean. He could speak fine, he was like cognizant of what was going on around him, and he was even apparently able to walk unassisted. And what's even more damning is that after being treated for only about an hour at the hospital, Cotahican was apparently in good enough health to be discharged and brought to jail. I'm telling you, they put an IV in him, and you know, he sat there for about an hour, and that's all it took for him to bounce back, you know, well enough to leave the hospital. I find this a bit strange. I mean, you'd think that after such a severe survival situation, you know, one so severe that it was necessary to put Coughlin out of his misery and kill him, I don't know, you'd think that Cotahican would have spent like days in the hospital recovering, not just hours, let alone 1 single hour. I'm no doctor, obviously, but I don't know. Doesn't that just seem a bit strange to you? And then what's even stranger are the results from David Coughlin's autopsy. It showed that Coughlin was in fact severely dehydrated, but that he was not like mere inches away from death or anything like that. All evidence suggests that if he had not been stabbed by Cotahican, he would have survived, especially with the hindsight of knowing that rescue was only a few hours away at the time. And so my question is, why did Cotahican kill David Coughlin if they both still had life left in them? Okay, so that's the question. Now I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit here. And so of course it's worth mentioning that Coughlin and Cotahican well, they were suffering, and thus they probably didn't realize that their bodies would hold out longer. And in addition to that, they definitely weren't thinking clearly. So I can understand them thinking that they were closer to death than they actually were, but I can't understand why Kodahikan would kill his best friend at his command so quickly. The next unanswered question I have, and this one might be the most confusing of all of them, is how Kodahikan was able to cover Coughlin's body with rocks. You'll recall that when Ranger Matson first stumbled into the campsite, Kodahikan directed him to like this pile of rocks that he had used in a makeshift burial for Coughlin. And honestly, maybe using the word rocks here is a bit of an understatement, because from the sources that I found, these weren't just like small little rocks. They were more like full-on boulders. I'm talking boulders between like 60 to 80 pounds each, not just little pebbles, okay? If Kodahikan was so weak and desperate from dehydration, how the hell was he able to move multiple heavy boulders to cover up Coughlin's body? And it gets even worse still. Now, I would take this next little bit of information with a grain of salt, because I only found one legitimate source that stated this, but according to that source, apparently Kodahikan's lawyer said that after he killed Coughlin, he also intended to kill himself, but he wasn't able to do that because he was apparently too weak. He didn't have the strength. But if he didn't have the strength to end his own life, how did he have the strength to move all of those boulders? It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, the biggest unanswered question I have, I kind of touched on this already, and this is also where I'm just gonna openly share my opinion, although you can probably tell what it is already. This question is, why the hell would you ever kill your best friend, or anyone for that matter, even if they asked for it? Now, I've never been, and hopefully never will be, in a situation as dire as the one Kodahikan and Coughlin found themselves in. And I don't know, maybe this is one of those situations where you shouldn't judge until you've been in their shoes. So if that's how you feel, then fair enough. But I don't know. I just can't ever imagine killing my best friend, even if they were begging for it. I'd like to think that I would never, ever give up in a situation like this and never resort to just ending it like that. I don't know, dude. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Ultimately, Rafi Kodahikan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with all but 2 of them suspended. I think I've been pretty harsh on Kodahikan in this video, but I do think it's important to note that David Coughlin's family, well, they showed no ill will towards him for taking Coughlin's life. In a letter they sent to the prosecutor of Kodahikan's case, Coughlin's family said, quote, "We can think of no reason why Rafi would have wished David any harm or pain. Moreover, we cannot presume to know what transpired or the thoughts and emotions that the 2 experienced during the days before David's death. To be sure, we have questions. However, we find it difficult to believe there was any malicious intent." During his sentencing, Kodahikan upheld that he believed he was doing the right thing by killing Coughlin, but also added that he regrets the way that things transpired. He said, quote, "This is something I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. This isn't a 2-year sentence for me. This is a life sentence. If one of us came out of that canyon, both of us should have. It's not fair that only one of us made it out." So, what do you guys think of this story? And also, perhaps more interestingly, what would you have done if you were in Rafi Kodahikan's shoes? Today, I'm going to be telling you 3 stories that, at first glance, seem like total BS. However, they're not. All 3 of these stories are 100% real. So real, in fact, that you probably couldn't even make this stuff up if you tried. From a man who disappeared in a ski resort in northern New York, only to reappear in Sacramento with no memory of how he got there a few days later, to a deadly booby trap left on a hiking trail in Utah. I'm telling you, these stories, they're fascinating and a little bit, pardon my language here, they're a little bit f***ed up, to be honest. So to start off here, let's head to an area that I know very, very well, that would be the Adirondacks of New York State. I absolutely love this place so much, and for that reason, I'm excited to take you all on a virtual trip there right now. And by the way, this trip costs no money. The only thing that you have to do is hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. In February of 2018, a group of Toronto-based coworkers took a ski trip to Whiteface Mountain in the Adirondacks. What was supposed to be, you know, a fun, normal vacation for these folks, well, it quickly turned into a mystery that was so bizarre that it would end up making national headlines very quickly. So at the time of this story, I was actually finishing up my senior year of college, only about an hour and a half away from Whiteface Mountain. I was at Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York. And because I was so close to where this happened, and because I've hiked Whiteface and skied it before, well, this story caught my attention right from the beginning, and I remember it unfolding quite well, and so I'm excited to tell this one. 50-year-old firefighter Danny Philippidis was in the group that went to Whiteface Mountain. On February 7th, Philippidis left his friends to take like a quick run back to his car so he could retrieve his phone, is my understanding. Now, obviously, I wasn't on the trip. I don't know these people, but from what I've gathered, I'll say, is that this group of skiers were just like, you know, they were just normal skiers. You know, they were staying inbounds in the resort. It's not like they were ducking ropes and then going, you know, deep into the backcountry. And by the way, the reason that I wanted to specify that is because, well, after Danny parted ways with his friends, he literally vanished into thin air. I feel like a lot of the stories that I read and hear about when it comes to missing skiers, well, a lot of the time I feel like they leave the boundaries of the resort, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and then they get lost as a result. But that is not what Danny was doing. He just disappeared. Super strange. And when he failed to meet his friends at the ski lodge later that day around 4 p.m., his friends and his coworkers unfortunately knew that something had gone horribly wrong. So Danny just vanishes off the mountain, basically, and his friends report him missing. And then after this, they searched hard for this dude. Searchers absolutely just swarmed the area around Whiteface Mountain, with desperation growing and growing with each passing day, by the way. I'm telling you, over 135 people were involved with the search. They used helicopters, and of course they used search dogs as well. They searched and they searched, but this yielded precisely no results. They just couldn't find him. He wasn't like trapped in the woods somewhere. He definitely wasn't hiding out in a hotel in the nearby town of Lake Placid. He wasn't found with like an injury off of a ski trail, and he wasn't even found back in his hometown of Toronto. However, he was eventually found, or more accurately, I should say, he reappeared. Danny finally reappeared, still dressed in all of his ski gear, by the way, in Sacramento, California. So that's pretty strange, and just to make it even stranger, Danny had no recollection of how the hell he got from Whiteface Mountain in New York State all the way to the West Coast, all the way to Sacramento. No idea. According to a Google Maps search that I did, Sacramento is some 2,865 miles away from Whiteface Mountain. It's literally the opposite side of the country. Now, when Danny was dropped off in Sacramento, he somehow had a brand new iPhone with him, and he had also managed to get a haircut along the way, and all this, and yet still the only thing that he could remember was that he ended up hitching a ride with a truck driver who told him somewhere along the way that they were driving through Utah. And so as more of these strange details started to come out, the story understandably got more and more press coverage. And to be honest, a lot of the details still remain a mystery, even to Danny himself, apparently. However, investigators have been able to piece together like an overall picture of what likely happened in this incredibly bizarre scenario. So it all started after Danny parted way with his friends on Whiteface Mountain that day. He apparently took a wrong turn while skiing back towards his car, and investigators believe that at some point going down the mountain, somewhere near a children's ski slope, ironically enough, he took a fall, which caused some sort of like traumatic brain injury affecting his judgment, and, well, completely wiping his memory. After this, he must have, gotten the rest of the way down the mountain and then flagged down a truck driver. And at that point, he began his trip across the country. The truck driver, or maybe even there was multiple drivers, we don't even know, but whoever these folks were that Danny hitched a ride with were never identified, unfortunately, and so we're probably never really gonna know, like, what Danny told them, and, like, especially about his intended destination. Like, I'd be incredibly curious to hear about that, but they weren't able to find any of these people, unfortunately. But what Danny eventually found was that he was in California, just like that. And he was dropped off near Richards Boulevard, which is just off of Interstate 5. And then the next day after this, he made his way about 13 miles to the Sacramento airport, where he was finally picked up and brought to the hospital. Another strange thing about this is that investigators still have no idea how he got from Richards Boulevard to the airport. And just as a reminder, once again, he was still wearing his ski clothing and his ski gear when he showed up there. My understanding is that Danny Philippidis would go on to make a full recovery from this bizarre incident, which is, awesome. Of course, we don't want anybody to get hurt here. And many doctors, at least in the articles that I read, have suggested that he probably suffered from amnesia. This could have been either due to a concussion or something else. Again, I don't really know, but I'm just so glad that he was okay. But he doesn't remember much from it, and so we're likely never gonna know exactly what the hell happened. I do remember, at the time that all of this happened, and especially after they found him in Sacramento, there was lots of, like, wild theories about how he ended up there or why he went there. Maybe he was running from something, all this stuff. But in the years that have passed since then, I think it's become pretty clear that this literally all just stemmed from the head injury. There was no conspiracy. It was just a very rare and bizarre case. Now, the searchers that were looking for Danny around Whiteface Mountain were absolutely just giving their all to find them. And though he wasn't there, it's not like he was purposely trying to hide from them, right? I mean, that seems like something that wouldn't happen. If you're lost, of course you want to be found. But in our next story, as searchers tore through the backcountry to try and find a missing hiker, this hiker was actually evading them because, well, she thought that they were chasing her. So, let's flash back to November of 1989. There's a young woman who had just graduated from college, and on November 4th, she decides to take a backpacking trip on the Foothills Trail in South Carolina. I would go on to hike the Foothills Trail myself some 30 years after this story took place, and it was great, although I will say it was far less eventful than this woman's hike. I've actually decided to keep her name anonymous in this story, honestly, because it happened so long ago, and I also feel like she probably doesn't look back on this experience with very fond memories. So this 22-year-old woman was about 6 months out of college, and she decided that a solo backpacking trip would be a good way to, like, spend some time pondering, where she was in her life and where she wanted to go next. At some point on her hike, she accidentally strayed from the trail and she found herself lost. And that's obviously an incredibly scary situation, of course. But for this woman, it was even scarier than it probably should have been, to be honest, because after she got lost, she became convinced that there were men in the woods who were trying to follow her and were trying to harm her. Again, this happened in 1989, so long ago, before the internet and stuff, obviously, and so there really isn't that much information about this story online. I could only find like 1 or 2 legitimate sources, and so I apologize about how general the rest of this story is going to sound, but I'm giving you what I know. And so with that said, authorities believe that this woman, after she got lost, she saw some hunters in the woods, and for whatever reason, she thought that these hunters were, like, coming after her. She even said that the men were carrying walkie-talkies and she could, like, hear them talking about her. I'm not exactly sure who reported her missing or even exactly when she was reported missing, for that matter, but at some point, search and rescue was called in to try and locate this missing woman. Authorities searched this very rugged and remote terrain for a full week. Again, they went all out. They utilized more than 100 people in the process, but eventually they made no progress, and so eventually they had to call off the search. And that could have been the end of the story, to be honest with you, but thankfully it wasn't. About 2 weeks after she had started her trip, this missing woman was found alive by, ironically enough, a different hunter. She was found in Table Rock State Park, which is near the highest point in South Carolina, which is Sassafras Mountain. And so they found her, and they took her to the hospital, of course, and thankfully she was pretty much okay. She had a few like infections on her feet from blisters and stuff, I'm sure, but otherwise she was in pretty good health, you know, especially given what she had just gone through for the past 2 weeks. However, when the authorities, you know, started to interview her and tried to get an idea of what the hell had happened, they quickly started to piece together an incredibly frustrating story, for the lack of a better word. So not only did this woman believe that the hunters were after her, but she also believed that the people that were searching for her, search and rescue, the authorities, all these people, she also believed that they might have been after her as well. She knew, you know, after enough time had passed that rescuers were likely going to be looking for her, but this poor woman was just so terrified that she actually hid from these rescuers, fearing that they might also have been after her, or that they were the men that were originally after her and trying to harm her. One official from this case said, quote, "From the very beginning, before the search was initiated, she became frightened or paranoid that someone was trying to run her down. We feel that had she wanted to come out and be rescued, the opportunity was probably there numerous times." The authorities also specified that there is no evidence that any hunters were stalking this poor woman. Another official said that he personally believed that the woman probably heard construction workers talking via walkie-talkie like speakers on their trucks, and that she had thought they were talking about her for some reason. And so all this is coming out, and the authorities are kind of piecing this together. And yet still after that, even after talking to the authorities and everything, the woman still insisted to the press that something wasn't right with her situation. She actually said, quote, "I could tell there was no good intent involved, and that she, quote, used instinct like a deer." Very strange story. And listen, please go easy on this woman in the comments here. I mean, she obviously made some bad choices, like we can acknowledge that, but at the end of the day, this was so long ago. I'm sure, you know, she was only 22. I'm sure she has probably gone on to regret a lot of her decision making in this story, and you know, thankfully no one was harmed in the process either. And so I hope that she was able to make a recovery physically and from this like paranoid mindset, and you know, I hope that she's doing well now. Seriously, I encourage you to leave some love for her in the comments as well. Now, the search for this woman was obviously very involved, and unfortunately, I couldn't find the name of the search and rescue agency responsible for looking for her. It's possible that it was just like volunteers working under the leadership of the government. I'm not sure what the search and rescue situation was like back then, but still, I love the mountains of northwestern South Carolina. I've spent a good amount of time up there. I even lived in Greenville, South Carolina for a couple months last year. And so with that said, my give back call out this week is going to be a volunteer group named Foothills Search and Rescue. Their mission is to, quote, "assist law enforcement and emergency agencies in locating lost and missing persons with highly trained search and rescue canine teams to help locate lost and missing persons." Once again, this group is made up of unpaid volunteers. I'm not affiliated with them at all, but I have made a donation to them. I like to call out these groups in most of my videos, so I'd encourage you to make a donation as well, even if it's just a few bucks. Doesn't have to be a lot. I'll have their website in the description if you can do that, please. So that was a very bizarre story. I feel like I'm using that word a lot in this video, bizarre. And our next story, to be honest, is equally as bizarre, although it is much more evil as well. And if you don't believe me, I'm not just being dramatic for the video. Take a look at this photo right here. In April of 2012, a Forest Service worker was patrolling along the Big Springs Hollow Trail near Orem, Utah, when he noticed something incredibly disturbing. Somebody had built a structure, like a man-made structure out of fallen trees and branches, and inside the structure were 2 booby traps. Now, thankfully, this Forest Service worker, who was named Officer James Scheffler, I'm pretty sure I'm saying that last name right, This gentleman had been trained in hazardous device detection. It just so happened that he had those skills. I believe, this isn't in my script, but I want to say when I was writing this, I remember seeing that he had served in Iraq or something like that. I know he was in the military at some point. And so, yeah, he had training in not only, being able to spot these kinds of devices, but also in how to disable them. And so that's what he did. When he found them, he took them apart. He made sure that they weren't a hazard to anybody anymore, which was incredibly lucky that he was the one that found them. Because if you just think about it, imagine if it was just like your average hiker, somebody like me, or even like a little kid or something. I mean, they wouldn't have known any better. They would have seen this interesting fort. They would have gone over, and then they would have easily fallen prey to these booby traps. This structure, this shelter, was built as a lure, essentially, like to kind of draw somebody in, and then once somebody stepped inside of it, they would have set off a tripwire. And when they did this, it would have caused a massive 20-pound spiked boulder to come swinging down and strike the unsuspected victim right in the head. And then there was another booby trap in there too. This one was designed to trip somebody and have them fall into a hidden bed of sharp wooden stakes that were sticking out of the ground, something straight out of like Vietnam. I mean, just an incredibly disturbing find that was clearly meant to kill or injure random hikers. Utah County Sheriff Sergeant Spencer Cannon said, quote, "It took some time to build these traps. They took rope, heavy-duty fishing line, and they intended what the traps were going to do. A lot of people go up there after dark as well. We're very, very fortunate that it was Officer Scheffler who found it." These traps were located only about a half-mile down the trail, very close to the popular Big Springs Park trailhead is my understanding, so just a terrible location for this. Cannon also said, quote, "Who goes up this trail thinking, I'm gonna have to look out for booby traps? A kid could say, oh cool, a shelter, and run right across the trip line." So naturally, the question is, who the hell would do this? Like, this is just evil. And also, why the hell would they do this? And we don't really have a clear answer to the second question there, but authorities thankfully were quickly able to find the answers to the first. So after this story broke, an anonymous person submitted a tip to the police based off of some photos they had seen on Facebook, of course. And these photos made it possible for the authorities to quickly discover that two young men from Orem and Provo were the ones responsible. 19-year-old Benjamin Rutkowski and 21-year-old Kay Matthew Christensen were arrested, and they soon argued that the traps were not intended to hurt people, but were rather for animals in the area. The authorities, however, were not buying this story. Cannon said, quote, "This is a shelter put together by people, visited by people. Anything that would be impacted by their device would have to be humans." Rutkowski's attorney argued that the young men were kind of just messing around, mimicking what they had seen on TV, Man vs. Wild, whatever. They were essentially just doing that. His attorney said, quote, "It was just a stupid decision. When he realized and thought about it, he went up there and tried to disable the devices, but by that time, the ranger had taken them down. I don't think they ever really intended anybody to get caught in the thing. It was more games, capture the flag, and military type of stuff. Just a couple of boys messing around." And who knows if that's true or not, but either way, it's a super sketchy situation. Now, both of these men were originally going to be charged with felonies, but these charges were later reduced to misdemeanor reckless endangerment, I guess because nobody was actually injured by the booby traps, thank God. In October of 2012, Benjamin Rutkowski was sentenced to 20 days in jail and a year of probation, which, I mean, he got lucky, dude. Very, very lucky that his sentence was so light, because if someone had been killed or injured by those traps, I feel like there's a pretty good chance that he would still be behind bars as I make this video. The other dude, Christensen, K. Christensen, well, he was sentenced to 30 days in jail and 18 months of probation. I really hope that during the years following 2012, these two young men got their freaking act together, dude. I hope that they learn their lesson, and I hope that they appreciate how lucky they are that they got away with these crimes relatively unscathed. Not even being charged with a felony. It could have been so much worse, and so I'm so glad that no one was hurt. In April of 2010, a young beautiful and adventurous girl began a solo trek through Nepal's Langtang National Park. I'm sure that everything seemed right in the world as she started off into the mountains, staring out at scenery that's so unbelievable that you normally only see it in screensavers. Unfortunately, this journey that started out so magically would end in total tragedy and heartbreak. Aubrey Sacco wouldn't have known it at the time, but as she crossed the border into Langtang National Park, she was marking the start of a mystery that would last for over a decade and counting. This mystery would have her family flying across the world on a whim multiple times. It would have 3 men being apparently falsely arrested and jailed, only to be released less than a month later. And this mystery would bring the dangers of solo trekking internationally, as well as the corruption and, dare I say, uselessness of the Nepalese government to the forefront of headlines in the United States and other Western nations. Countless search hours, 3 arrests, and theory after theory after theory, and yet nobody knows what the hell happened to Aubrey Sacco. This is the story of her mysterious disappearance and the search that followed. In April of 2010, 23-year-old Aubrey Sacco was nearing the end of a 5-month journey throughout Asia. The Colorado native was fascinated with Eastern culture, and during her adventure, she had spent time in Sri Lanka and India. She wanted to end this epic trip on a high note, and so she planned to visit one more country before returning to the United States. That would be the country of Nepal. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip to Nepal together. Now, this trip is totally free for you, but you do have to hit the subscribe button to cover your admission. I mean, I think that's a pretty fair deal, right? Aubrey had graduated from CU Boulder in 2009 with a degree in psychology and art therapy. She loved yoga, and she was also an avid traveler with a great appreciation for the natural world around her. And so, given all of this, it's not surprising that she didn't just want to visit Nepal's cities. She wanted to go and experience the beauty of Nepal's mountains, its rivers, and its valleys. Though there's definitely no shortage of places to go trekking in Nepal, the one that she chose for her week-long excursion was Langtang National Park in the Himalayan mountains. Langtang National Park encompasses miles and miles and miles of protected wilderness, and there's tons of trails and small mountain villages that lie within its borders. It's incredibly remote, and visitors are actually required to travel 7 hours by bus from Nepal's capital city of Kathmandu just to reach the park's boundaries. On April 21st, 2010, Aubrey Sacco was fresh off this long bus ride, and she was eager to start her journey. She passed through a military checkpoint at the base of the Himalayas, and then she was off. The woman that was manning the checkpoint actually remembered seeing Aubrey. She specifically remembered her, and she also remembered her smile. Unfortunately, this positive encounter would soon prove to be the start of a timeline of Aubrey's known whereabouts in Langtang National Park leading up to her disappearance. So after she leaves this military checkpoint, she continued trekking north all by herself. I'm not sure if she was aware of this, but at the time, and actually still to this day for that matter, I believe, both the US State Department and the government of Nepal itself strongly recommends against solo trekking in the country. This was just a recommendation in 2010. I do not believe it was illegal to do so. I do believe that has since changed, however. I read that starting in 2023, tourists, they're now required to hire a licensed guide before trekking through the wilderness in Nepal. Around 10 a.m., Aubrey arrived at the Namaste guest house, which was her final destination planned for the day. She apparently spent the rest of the day just hanging out and relaxing, taking in the scenery, and at some point she met a local trekking guide whose name I'm gonna have a hard time with, but I'm gonna try. His name was Renzing Dorji Yonzan. Aubrey and Renzin, we'll call him. Apparently, these two were quite fond of each other's company, and they spent hours talking to each other that evening. Aubrey was eager to learn more about the local culture and customs, and in order to help her do this, Renzin actually gave her a copy of a book called, quote, Ethnic Groups in Nepal. Some people believe that Aubrey and Renzin may have spent the night together that night, but nobody really knows for sure what happened. We do know, however, that the following morning, the two of them, well, they split up. Renzin was actually traveling south down into the valley, while Aubrey continued her trek north up into the mountains. Her time spent with Renzin is an important part of her timeline moving through Langtang National Park. On the morning of April 22nd, Aubrey continued further into the mountains. This is obviously a wilderness area that she's traveling in, but my understanding is that she still would have encountered plenty of people along the way. Other trekkers, certainly, but also locals who live in the small villages dotting the Langtang Valley. She also would have encountered military personnel and probably porters as well. Eventually, Aubrey reached the small village of Lama Hotel, which, like many of the villages in Nepal, can only be reached on foot. My understanding is that Lama Hotel pretty much only exists to serve tourists that trek to it. It's tiny. It pretty much just has a few tea houses, a few places to get some food, a few places to stay, and that's pretty much it. It's a small place, but it plays a very big role in Aubrey's timeline. So apparently she was seen by the locals in Lama Hotel drinking soda, eating food, and possibly reading the book that Renzin had given her the previous day. At one point, she made her way into the Sherpa Hotel and Lodge, and she sat down at a table. After she did this, she spent some time just kind of lounging around here, and she began talking with three local men in their late teens and early 20s while she was in there. I wasn't able to find the names of these men. Knowing myself, I wouldn't have been able to pronounce them anyways, and so I have no idea who they were or what they were up to. However, I do know that at some point during her conversation with these men, Aubrey said that she was going to continue on to the next village, which is called Riverside. At this point, morning had come and gone, but it wasn't super late either. It was like early afternoon, and Aubrey felt that she could easily reach the village safely in a reasonable time frame to spend the night there. These unnamed men apparently disagreed with her about this. They insisted that it was just too late in the day for her to make the trek, and for whatever reason, Aubrey would end up concluding that they were lying to her. And so with that, she grabbed her gear and she left, presumably to start her trek to Riverside. But she never made it. To this day, Aubrey Sacco has not been seen, dead or alive, since she departed the lodge in Lama Hotel. Aubrey was very good about keeping in touch with her parents back in Colorado. She apparently was emailing or calling them just about every day. I'm sure it was expected that communication would be tough while she was on her trek, because I mean, she's in the wilderness. This is a remote place, but once again, her trip through the Langtang Valley was only supposed to last for 1 week. So her parents didn't hear from her, and then after a week plus a few days had gone by, her parents did start to get incredibly worried. They got so worried, in fact, that they even contacted the US Embassy in Kathmandu. The officials at the embassy noted that there had been some political unrest in Nepal at the time, and that could have possibly delayed her travel. So maybe she was still out there in the national park, she was safe and sound, and she was just running a bit behind. This definitely seemed plausible at first, but as more and more days passed by, Aubrey's parents still heard nothing from her. And so eventually they decided that they needed to take matters into their own hands. Aubrey's father, Paul, and her older brother, Crofton, actually flew to Nepal on May 16th, 2010. And when they arrived, they were eager to figure out what the hell was going on. By this point, a search was already underway in Langtang National Park, but of course they hadn't found anything yet. And so they travel to the border of the park, and then Paul Sacco, who was fresh out of a recent hip surgery, by the way, began trekking up the very same path that his daughter had traveled on less than a month earlier. As Paul and Crofton began their investigation, they remained hopeful that Aubrey would be found alive, or even that they would coincidentally just run into her on the trail. I mean, it's certainly possible that while they were hiking up, she could have finally been ready and able to hike out, and so they could have intersected each other, but unfortunately, this didn't happen. The days dragged on. They searched the mountains and the trail just tirelessly, and no results. So eventually, Crofton returned to Colorado, but Paul stayed behind and continued to investigate. He met with the Nepal police, he met with U.S. embassy officials, and he interviewed anybody who could have possibly had some answers in his daughter's disappearance. Despite his best efforts, he didn't get any closer, and he had no choice but to return home. I can't imagine how painful that return flight must have been, because, yeah, I just said it there. On his return flight home, he was no closer to finding his daughter than he was when he first landed in Nepal. However, the investigation didn't just stop after Paul returned to Colorado. The Sackos enlisted the help of a local guide back in Nepal who interviewed folks from the Lama Hotel village during the summer of 2010. It's through these interviews that they learned many of the details of Aubrey's timeline leading up to her disappearance, the very same details that I shared earlier in the video. The investigation is just dragging on at this point, and the longer that it dragged on, the more things just didn't seem to add up. The Sackos arrived in Nepal again in July of 2011, and once again they trekked to Lama Hotel in order to re-interview some of the locals that had reportedly seen Aubrey the year prior. This time, the stories that they were told were different. A few of the people they interviewed changed their mind, and all of a sudden, now they're saying they had never seen Aubrey. Overall, they just seemed unwilling to provide any information, which was incredibly frustrating to the Sackos. And unfortunately, things weren't much better when it came to the Nepal police either. The Sackos were told that the police had conducted multiple searches for Aubrey, that they had interviewed and re-interviewed the villagers and this Renzin Dorji guy, and they had also apparently interviewed members of Nepal's army that were stationed along the trail that Aubrey was following. They were told all these things, and yet despite all of that, the Sackos began to doubt how seriously the police were taking their daughter's disappearance. Now, I don't know much about Nepal. I've never been there, but just from what I understand from researching, this country isn't exactly known for having the best justice system or investigative skills for that matter. Corruption runs deep, and this made it all but impossible for the Sackos to find a stable, trustworthy contact working for the government of Nepal. Now, I really hate to say this, but at some point it must have dawned on the Sackos that foul play could be the reason that their daughter vanished. I mean, of course, anytime someone goes missing, the possibility of foul play is always brought up and explored, but in this case, it seemed especially likely. And I say that because, well, Langtang National Park had some pretty shady recent history when it came to trekkers. An alarmingly high amount of trekkers have gone missing in Nepal, and in Langtang National Park specifically, there have been numerous cases of Western female trekkers being assaulted, many of them hiking solo without a guide, by the way, just like Aubrey. In 2005, 2 different French women disappeared in the park, and this prompted the Nepal police to state that they actually believed a serial killer was roaming the area. In December of 2011, a different woman from the United States was threatened and attacked by a man wearing a black mask and carrying a knife. Fortunately, in this case, the woman was actually able to escape, but then a few months later, in May of 2012, a female tourist disappeared and was soon found murdered off of the trail in Langtang Valley. Coincidentally, but also disturbingly, both of these girls were 23 years old, the exact same age as Aubrey Sacco. And those are only a few of the disappearances and murders of trekkers in Nepal. The truth is that we really have no idea how many people have gone missing or run into foul play out there. The government doesn't really do a very good job of tracking or reporting these cases, and maybe that's intentional, maybe it's not, but regardless, we know that crime has been an issue for trekkers in Nepal. In fact, there's been so many disappearances that an entire website called missingtrekker.com has been created to document and spread the word about those missing in the country. And that should illustrate just how common this is. And so with some of these sketchy disappearances and crimes in mind, both of which happened before and after Aubrey disappeared, by the way, I imagine that foul play was certainly on the minds of Aubrey's family, in addition to the obvious grief and, of course, the lack of closure. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Aubrey's family got the official news that she had been murdered and her killers had been caught. On August 1st, 2013, right around 8 p.m., the Sackos received a phone call from a Nepalese man that they had been working with on Aubrey's disappearance. This man said that his father, who lived in Langtang, had heard that not one, not two, but 3 local men had been arrested after they confessed to the murder of Aubrey Sacco. So within the day, the Sackos were communicating with the US Embassy in Nepal, and they were learning more details about what the hell had happened. Finally, over 2 years after Aubrey's disappearance, her family were starting to get some closure. The news of these arrests quickly made its way from local headlines all the way to national and even international headlines. There was just something about Aubrey's case that struck a nerve with people. I mean, I can't place my finger on it exactly, but if I had to guess, it's because of the positive energy that Aubrey just gave off. Even just from the photos of her, you can kind of see what I mean, right? She just seems so content, so happy. She seems like the kind of person that bad things just aren't supposed to happen to. An undercover investigation had been conducted in Nepal, and during the course of this investigation, one man had actually confessed to murdering Aubrey. Eventually, this very same man, well, he ratted on 2 other men, and with that, plus the alleged discovery of Aubrey's clothing at one of the man's houses, boom, case closed. Well, actually, that's how things would have gone if there was any sense of justice in this case and in the Sackos world. Shortly after the Sackos received news of these arrests, around the same time that the story was just exploding across international headlines, the Sackos learned, in cruel fashion, that these arrests were a false alarm. Apparently, the men had changed their story, and the reports that the police had found Aubrey's clothing was just complete BS. The Sackos wrote on Facebook, quote, "The US Embassy confirmed again that the reports about Aubrey were prematurely leaked to the Nepal media and were inaccurate. This is what we were afraid might happen, as Nepal's media can be very unreliable. Although 3 arrests were made, the rest of the reports were wrong. There were no admissions made and no camera or clothing found. The 3 parties were questioned, but the results were inconclusive." These 3 men were all released 28 days later. And so just like that, the Sackos, they were back to square one. And as much as it pains me to say this, my understanding is that there really hasn't been any updates in this case since those false arrests. That's not to say that the Sackos have given up on trying to find their daughter, however. Since 2013, the Sackos have continued to work tirelessly to find the answers they so desperately deserve, as well as to improve safety for future trekkers in Nepal. They've hired local private investigators to follow up on leads. They've interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses countless times, and they eventually pushed hard enough that all of these witnesses were actually polygraphed. Paul Sacco has gone back to Nepal multiple times to follow up on new clues, and the family continues to actively seek out new information about what could have happened to this day. And yet, despite their tremendous efforts, 14 years have gone by. 14 years, and we still don't have any idea what occurred in April of 2010. I had the pleasure of communicating with Paul Sacco about this story, and I asked him if he had any message that he wanted to pass on to you through this video, and here is exactly what he told me. Quote, "Don't hike without a guide or a group of people. What I'm going to say next is controversial. The mountains of Nepal are a dangerous place, and not so much because of the natural dangers. The military, who guard the national parks, may actually be the foxes guarding the hen house. Or there could even be serial killers roaming the national parks, some of whom could even have ideological motivations against foreigners. This is not the safe place described in Lonely Planet. Despite this though, the people of Nepal, by and large, are a wonderful, peace-loving people, denied an education by their government and victimized by their government's corruption. So, what could have happened to Aubrey Sacco? I mean, I've harped on the foul play theory a lot in this video, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that it's possible that she did experience an accident while trekking, something like a fall or a slip, something natural like that. The fact is that accidents do happen to hikers, especially solo hikers, in wild and remote areas. But at the same time, I don't know, foul play just really seems to be the leading theory here. In addition to the possibility that she was murdered, there's also been theories over the years, kind of like Paul just touched on there, that the soldiers who patrol the area might have had something to do with her disappearance. In 2010, only a few months after Aubrey disappeared, 3 women from France were allegedly SA'd by soldiers stationed at a checkpoint close to where Aubrey was last seen. Now, it should be noted that this checkpoint is further up the trail than Aubrey is suspected to have made it, but it is close enough that it's awfully suspicious. Still though, I mean, there's never been any proof of foul play. Nothing like that has ever been found. I don't know, it's a sad case, and I hope that someday the Saccos get the closure that they so badly desire and deserve. So if you have any information about what happened to Aubrey, I put an email address in the description that you can reach out to in order to reach her family. And in addition to that, if you're interested in supporting the search for Aubrey, my give back call out this week is aubreysacco.com. You can go there, you can either make a donation, which is what I did, or you can purchase some art. I'm not affiliated with this website or the search fund in any way, but I did want to mention this because I feel for the Saccos. They were so kind in helping me make this video, and I just hope that my audience can help make a difference. In 1983, an anonymous family took a trip to Yosemite National Park, and they settled in for the day at an area known as Summit Meadow. The children were frolicking around, playing in the beautiful and unfamiliar terrain, when all of a sudden, something stopped them in their tracks. The children had accidentally stumbled upon a horrifying sight, one that would send shockwaves throughout Yosemite National Park. The children found a thawed human hand and forearm. Naturally, investigators immediately began working to identify these remains, and they also immediately ran into roadblocks. Nobody had been reported missing. They ended up making a recreation of the victim's face, but this produced absolutely no leads whatsoever. The case quickly went cold, and it stayed that way for literal decades. But then, nearly 40 years later, the authorities dropped an absolute bombshell. Finally, in the year 2021, the identity of the Yosemite National Park Jane Doe had been found. And when her name was released to the public, the story behind her disappearance and death instantly became even more bizarre and even more disturbing than it had already been. She was linked to a cult leader who would end up running from the law and then vanishing into thin air. After this, a notorious serial killer would go on to admit to killing her, even providing verifiable details about what happened. And the strangest part is that these two people were completely unconnected, and neither one of them was ever charged with the woman's murder. So with all that said, the obvious question is, what the hell happened here? I'll attempt to answer that and much more in this video. I will be doing my very best to tell the story behind what I believe is the weirdest death in national park history. I don't use the word weird lightly, folks. I mean, a discovery of a human hand in a national park is already weird enough, and then the events that followed made this story literally 1,000 times weirder. And not only is this story incredibly weird, but it's also incredibly disturbing. I find it particularly disturbing that such a tragic tale was launched from within the borders of a national park, which is obviously supposed to be a place of peace and beauty, not a place of death and mystery. So the year that we're starting off in is 1983. In the spring of that year, an anonymous family did what literally thousands of families had done before them and would go on to do after them. They took a vacation to the famous Yosemite National Park. So with that said, we're gonna take a trip there now too, although it's not really a vacation, but either way, we're gonna take a trip there as I tell this story. This trip is totally free for you, but you gotta hit that subscribe button, subscribe to the channel, help us get to 1 million subscribers. We've got a long ways to go. Do that, that will cover your admission for this trip. So anyways, at some point during their trip to Yosemite, they stopped at an area that is known as Summit Meadow. Now, I've been to Yosemite National Park before, but I have not been to Summit Meadow. So if you have been there, leave a comment and let us know what it's like. I mean, I would just imagine that it's incredibly beautiful. I mean, even serene, you could say, just like the rest of the park. I mean, after all, Yosemite is one of the most popular national parks in the United States for a reason, right? So this family was just relaxing. They're taking in the scenery of the meadow, and the children in particular were doing what children do, especially on vacation. They were just running around. They're exploring. They're just soaking up the fun of this special and new place for them. But unfortunately, things would not remain fun for very long, because as I told you in the intro, these very children would end up finding something that no child, no person for that matter, should ever have to lay their eyes on. These children discovered a human hand and forearm just tucked away there in the meadow. I mean, just an absolutely horrifying sight. So obviously the family reported this, it was investigated, and it was soon determined that the human remains had been there at least since the previous fall, as they had been frozen over the winter, apparently, and they were like thawing out when they were finally discovered. I mean, just a horrifying, disturbing thing to happen on your vacation. And so as soon as the discovery of the hand and the forearm were reported to the authorities, they obviously began searching for the rest of the body. They searched and they searched, but it would end up taking years before they found anything else connected to this case. So 5 years, actually. 5 years go by after this initial discovery, and then a skull with no jawbone, interestingly enough, was discovered near the area where the hand and the forearm had previously been found by the children. They find this skull, but that was it. The rest of the body was still missing, and perhaps even more disturbingly than that is the fact that the identity of the body was undetermined and missing as well. Investigators poured through missing persons reports, but they didn't find anything that could be linked to the mysterious case in Yosemite National Park. Nobody came forward to report that the remains may have belonged to somebody they knew. I mean, the authorities tried everything. They even made various facial reconstructions, which they then shared with the media, hoping that somebody, anybody, would recognize this woman. All of this effort proved absolutely fruitless, and so after 1988, the case truly went cold. I mean, just continuing to haunt Yosemite with each passing year. Pretty weird, right? Well, wait until you hear this. We're now going to flash forward in time, 38 years in time to be exact. Now, if you subscribe to cover your admission to the trip to Yosemite, it's this time travel, it's already included, but if you didn't subscribe, you can go ahead and do that now, and then that will include your time travel. Okay, ready to time travel? Here we go. Ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, now it's 2021. You heard that right, 2021, and there's a lot of new forensic technology that did not exist in 1983. One of these tools is called forensic genealogy, and I am obviously not an expert on this. I'm far from an expert. My only forensic experience consists of binge watching forensic files when I was in college, but I'm gonna try to do my best to explain this concept in layman's terms. Investigators were able to obtain a DNA profile from the remains that were found, and they were able to use this profile to create like a family tree, right? And so they're studying this family tree, getting closer and closer to the identity of the Yosemite Jane Doe. Through this process, which again, I don't really understand, obviously, they were eventually able to come up with a list of potential matches and then test DNA from these matches until they were able to confirm that the remains were that of a woman named Patricia Hicks. So, I mean, this is just crazy. 38 years later, and all of a sudden, boom, we have a major break in a cold case that most people had, unfortunately, long since forgotten about. Hopefully by now you're starting to understand why I keep calling this case so weird. And by the way, if you think everything I've said so far isn't weird enough, wait until you hear the backstory of Patricia Hicks and her disappearance. Patricia Hicks was a native of Washington State and was actually born in the 1950s. She was very young, middle school age, I believe, when her brother tragically took his own life, which left a deep impact on the young Patricia, one that she would pretty much never fully recover from. She had a brief marriage in her early adult years before she finally up and left, moving to Merced, California. And once she got there, she met up with a man named Donald Eugene Gibson. I have a feeling that some of you might actually recognize that name, and not for good reason. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I was before I learned about this story, Donald Gibson was, or potentially is, I don't know, he was a famous, or rather infamous, cult leader who began gathering followers in the late 1970s. In 1981, he was arrested and put on trial for drugging and, I'm just gonna say, essaying, you could probably figure out what I mean there, essaying multiple teenage boys, which is just incredibly disturbing. And if it's even possible to make this situation even more disturbing, apparently these assaults would be done as part of his sick, like, cult ritual. Gibson was found guilty and then subsequently released from custody while he awaited his sentence. And after this happened, he predictably took off. He ran from the law, he never reappeared in court, and he was never seen ever again. Authorities believe that he fled to Mexico after this, but I mean, we're likely never gonna know exactly what happened after he was released by the police. So we know that Patricia Hicks was, you know, in proximity to Gibson. She was kind of in his circle, but we don't really know the extent of her relationship to him. However, it is highly suspected that she was a member of his cult. And interestingly enough, right after Gibson ran from the law and disappeared, so too did Patricia Hicks. According to one of her friends, after Gibson ran away from the law, Patricia took a bus from Merced to Yosemite National Park. The year is 1982, and after she did this, she was never seen alive ever again. And at this point in her life, she was only 27 years old. So her connection to an infamous cult leader is obviously hard to ignore in this case. I mean, it's certainly possible that she was killed by Gibson, or at least by one of his associates or something, but this is only a theory and it has never been proven true. It should be noted that the prosecutor in Gibson's case did say that Gibson would have been capable of violence against anyone who betrayed him, but even with that said, we just don't really have the necessary details to pin her disappearance and her death on Gibson himself. Pretty weird, right? I keep saying that. It's super weird, and folks, the weirdness does not end here, because there are actually a few other potential suspects in Patricia's death, and all of them are every bit as infamous as Donald Eugene Gibson. In fact, one of them even confessed to killing her. With that said, let me introduce you to the monster that is Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas was a serial killer who was convicted of 11 different killings, most of which occurred in the state of Texas. However, like is the case in most serial killers, it seems like, there are many more victims that Lucas is suspected of killing, even though he was never convicted for them. And as you've probably predicted by now, one of these potential suspected victims was Patricia Hicks. Henry Lee Lucas told investigators that in the early 1980s, he noticed a young woman hitchhiking near Yosemite National Park. He allegedly picked her up, drove her to a campsite nearby Summit Meadow, where the two then drank beer, ate fried chicken, and eventually hooked up. After all this happened, because Lucas was a deranged lunatic, he apparently killed her. Now, it should be noted that Lucas confessed to all of this stuff long before Patricia Hicks was identified, and he never actually gave like a real name for this victim. However, investigators did locate an abandoned campsite near Summit Meadow, and this campsite contained beer cans and also scattered chicken bones. And so that obviously seems pretty promising, right? Like this evidence has to be significant. But with all of that said, there is a major red flag here that I have not mentioned yet. After he was arrested, Henry Lucas went on like a confession spree of sorts. He basically realized that he would get special treatment from the police. You know, he'd get things like cigarettes and better food while authorities were investigating his involvement in these alleged murders. He was basically trying to like cheat the system to get this special treatment. And so he would go on to confess to over, ready for it? 600 murders in his life. And most of these murders were quickly proven to be 100% false. It's because of this that his confession to Patricia Hicks' murder is just very difficult to take at face value. But then again, on the other hand, investigators for the National Park Service apparently have come out and publicly stated that they believe he likely had something to do with Patricia Hicks' death. In 2020, the Park Service said, quote, he, referring to Henry Lucas that is, has information about this murder that had not been made public and could only be known by the person who committed the crime. So that seems pretty promising, of course, but unfortunately, Henry Lee Lucas was never charged, let alone convicted, of killing Patricia Hicks, and at this rate, I think it's safe to say that he probably won't ever be. Well, actually, I shouldn't even say probably. I'll say definitely, because in 2001, the 64-year-old Henry Lucas died in prison from congestive heart failure. This was a good 20 years before Patricia Hicks's remains were even identified, and so his death essentially closed the door on the possibility of getting any additional, potentially incriminating evidence out of him. Though he still remains a prime suspect, obviously, believe it or not, there's actually another serial killer that could potentially be linked to Patricia Hicks's death. And this man is perhaps the most infamous serial killer in all of Yosemite National Park history. So, a little while back, I made a video telling the story of Cary Stayner, who would go on to be known as the Yosemite Park Killer after he brutally murdered 4 women near the park in the year 1999. I mentioned at the end of that video that Stayner may have been responsible for more killings than he was actually convicted for, and one of those killings was that of Patricia Hicks. Though Stayner committed his confirmed crimes years after Patricia Hicks had been killed, he too had a strange connection to cult leader Donald Gibson. That's right, we're gonna kind of bring some of this full circle here. Now, it's unclear to me exactly what the connection between the two men was, but Stayner was from Merced, California, and apparently his family actually knew the family of Donald Eugene Gibson. Now, I will say the following details are definitely unconfirmed, just to give a disclaimer here, but I did find a few sources which stated that Patricia Hicks had actually been arrested along with other associates of Gibson in the year 1980. And according to these same sources, she actually testified against Gibson at his trial. But again, I can't confirm whether or not this was true. It seemed a little shaky to me when I was researching it, so take that with a grain of salt. However, since we're already this deep, let's just assume for a second that it is true. And if that's the case, Cary Stayner would have known that she testified, because apparently he actually attended Donald Gibson's trial, again, for unknown reasons. Since it's long been suspected that Cary Stayner had killed more victims than he was ever held responsible for and convicted for, it seems, I don't know, somewhat reasonable, you could say, to suggest that Stayner may have killed Patricia Hicks in retaliation for her testimony against Donald Gibson. And this theory makes even more sense when you consider the fact that Cary Stayner was extremely familiar with Yosemite National Park and obviously would later go on to commit his known murders against visitors and an employee of that park. But with all that said, Cary Stayner never confessed to the killing or even knowing Patricia Hicks for that matter. No hard evidence has ever been found to connect him to her killing. Stayner is still alive in prison as of the making of this video, but unfortunately it seems unlikely that he will make any more confessions. Now, those are all like the murder theories, the spicy stuff, the disturbing stuff, I guess. But there is one more potential explanation for Patricia Hicks's death. Again, I think that murder and foul play is definitely likely here, especially given her connection to Gibson or even, again, Henry Lucas. But consider just for a moment that maybe her death was actually accidental. I have no idea what the purpose of Patricia's trip to Yosemite was, but I mean, it is a national park after all, and so it's likely that she wanted to experience its natural beauty, of course. In order to do this, it's plausible to assume that she would have been hiking or camping, which opens up the possibility that she fell or became injured in the backcountry and died as a result. Now, after hearing that, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, Kyle, come on, her hand and her arm were found by those children. How could that have happened if her death was an accident? But to that I'll say, consider this. Is it possible that Patricia had a backcountry accident and then her remains were like scavenged by animals in the park, which then led to her arm being separated from the rest of her body? This would also explain why her skull was found without a jawbone and the rest of her body was never found at all. Of course, there's also the, albeit unlikely, possibility that she was killed by an animal in the park. I mean, you got to consider that, of course. Could a bear or a mountain lion have killed her and then kind of scattered her remains afterwards? Again, we don't have any real evidence of this. I'm totally speculating right now, but it certainly is a possibility, even if it's remote. But to play devil's advocate against myself, if those theories were true, it would be a giant coincidence that Patricia just so happened to be tied to the cult leader Gibson and the serial killers Lucas and Stayner. And so because of that, I personally believe that foul play was the most likely scenario that led to her disappearance and her death. But unfortunately, I find it really hard to believe that we're ever gonna get a real answer to this case. But then again, I probably would have said the same thing about learning her identity prior to 2021. So I don't know. You really never know, guys. So with that said, what do you think happened to Patricia Hicks? Do you think the connection to the cult leader is so obvious that it must play a role in her death? Or do you believe Henry Lucas's confession about killing her? And of course, what do you think about the possibility of her accidentally dying in the backcountry? Hopefully at this point, you all realize why I'm calling this the weirdest death in national park history. The entire story is just so strange, and I hope that someday the world will get some answers about what the hell happened to Patricia Hicks. My heart goes out to Patricia Hicks, and of course to her friends and family. Today I'm going to be sharing 3 stories involving hikers that sound like total BS when you first hear them, but are actually 100% true. From one of the most miraculous rescues you've ever heard of, to a few hikers who made some questionable choices with technology in the backcountry, I think these stories will warm your heart, maybe scare you a bit, and even make you cringe. So with that said, let's head over to one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Now, I'm taking you there for free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. We're shooting for 1 million subscribers on this channel. We've got a long ways to go, I'll admit, and I think hitting the subscribe button in exchange for all this free content is a pretty fair deal. In October of 2022, an anonymous female in her 20s decided to go for a hike on the Colorado Trail. She was from northern New Mexico, not terribly far from the Deer Park area outside of Silverton, Colorado, where her hike was to take place. Because her identity has remained anonymous, I'm not sure what her hiking experience was or even what her specific plans for this hike were. I do, however, know that she was only planning on being out for a day hike. Unfortunately, though, this is not what would happen, as this hiker would end up spending multiple nights alone in the Colorado wilderness with no warm overnight gear. So this anonymous woman is day hiking down the Colorado Trail, and at some point during her hike, she ended up straying away from the trail and ended up near the bank of the Animas River. Now, it's unclear to me if she purposely left the trail or if it was an accident and she kind of got turned around or something. And the circumstances of what happened next is also unclear to me. One thing I've come to realize since I started covering all these stories for my channel is that very often specific details will vary between different news reports, but regardless of that, I know for a fact that while this hiker was off trail near the river, she fell off a cliff and she fell hard. The reason for her fall is what's unclear to me. Some articles stated it was because she was trying to take pictures, but then another article made it seem like she was trying to get back to the trail when she fell. So I'm not exactly sure why she fell, but I do know that she did indeed fall off a cliff face. Then she tumbled a bit, and then she fell almost 100 feet or 30 meters. Somehow, this woman survived the fall. But despite this, she was still in a lot of trouble, obviously. She had broken her leg and suffered a concussion, and she was now severely immobilized. Hiking herself out of the rough Colorado terrain was basically 100% impossible. And so at this point, unless somebody found her or spotted her, she was completely and utterly screwed. Once again, this woman had no warm overnight gear with her, and the Colorado mountains just so happened to be experiencing a cold spell during her ordeal. In a desperate effort to survive, the woman crawled, not walked, but crawled over to a nearby cliff face and sort of burrowed herself in as best she could. After all, this was her only chance at getting some shelter given the circumstances. And it must have worked at least a little bit, because she somehow survived for 2 nights like this, though she did apparently go in and out of consciousness at times, and she was definitely becoming severely dehydrated. So obviously this woman was in an extremely dangerous situation, and though she was eventually reported missing, she still had not been located by the late morning of her 3rd day. But this woman was not giving up, and it just so happens that the area she was stranded in presented a unique opportunity for her to be spotted. On the other side of the Animas River from where she was stranded was a set of train tracks for the Durango-Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad. My understanding is that this is a scenic railroad most frequently used by tourists, which meant that those passing through the area from the train would be looking out the windows. The stranded woman managed to crawl herself over to the bank of the river to a spot where she could potentially be spotted from those on the passing trains. When a train went by, she would desperately wave, and this bold strategy would end up being her salvation. So this is crazy. Just before noon on the 3rd day of her ordeal, a passenger on the train just so happened to see the lost woman waving to the train from the opposite side of the river. One of the most miraculous parts of this story is that apparently the woman was only visible from like a very specific angle at a very specific point on the railroad. The passenger just so happened to look at the exact right spot during the exact right time and noticed the woman, and then alerted the train crew. The crew then alerted the inspection motor car that was following behind the train. The driver of this inspection car stopped and then made verbal contact with the woman, learning that she was immobilized. They were still on opposite sides of the river, but they were able to communicate, and so the driver waited there while proper help and medical professionals were contacted, and eventually 2 individuals from another train, one of whom I guess was a paramedic from the Durango Fire Department, made their way across the dangerous and cold river to assist the stranded woman. It was eventually decided that her condition was extreme enough to warrant an air evacuation, and throughout the afternoon, search and rescue members worked to make this happen. She was eventually brought to the hospital and thankfully survived. My understanding is that Silverton Medical Rescue was one of the primary organizations involved in the rescue of this woman. Now, I'm not affiliated with them at all. They don't even know I'm making this video or anything, but I did make a donation to them, and I encourage you to do the same. I'm really trying to give back to these search and rescue organizations in my videos now, and so I've linked their website in the description. So I think the biggest lesson from this story is that you definitely should not rely on dumb luck to save your life. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that it did save this woman's life, and she certainly was resourceful enough to take advantage of the fact that the railroad was there, but I mean, it was luck. It was a miracle that the woman just so happened to be near the train tracks, and it was even more of a miracle that she was spotted from one of the passing trains. If she had been in a more remote area, it's very likely that she would have died. This could have been prevented if she had carried a satellite GPS device with an SOS button. She definitely could have used something like this to call for help as soon as she was immobilized. She also could have used that or a GPS app on her phone or even a paper map to find her way back to the Colorado Trail before she even fell and became injured. So yeah, it's a miracle that this woman survived. And the hiker in our next story also experienced a miracle after finding himself in a life or death situation due to his cell phone. Just north of Vancouver, Canada, there exists a mountain called Mount Frome. It's part of the North Shore Range, and my understanding is that it's most popular among mountain bikers. There are a number of bike trails on the mountain, but there is also a few hiking trails as well. The main trail to the summit approaches from the south of the mountain. There is no trail to the summit of Mount Frome from the north. But if I had told you that even just a few months ago, you might not have believed me if you checked Google Maps first. For whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure why, to be honest, Google Maps showed a hiking trail leading to the summit of Mount Frome from the north side of the mountain, starting near the Kennedy Falls area. And therefore, in November of 2023, an ill-prepared, again, anonymous hiker set out to hike this non-existent trail. And he certainly did his best. I'm not even sure how the hell he made it as far as he did, but one thing is for sure. He eventually found himself at a standstill, trapped on a cliff, unable to continue in any direction any further without risking death. And so at this point, the hiker called for help, and the North Shore Rescue Team, a local search and rescue organization from that area, sprung into action. And the situation sounded awfully familiar to them. And that's because the exact same thing had happened just over a month earlier. In September of 2023, a hiker called 911 stating that he was, quote, stuck on a cliff on the backside of Mount Frome. He also stated that he was hanging on for his life and was unsure how much longer he could hold on for. I mean, damn. North Shore Rescue and Talon helicopters quickly responded, and wearing night vision goggles, since it was dark by this point, they were able to identify the location where the man was stuck. He had been shining a light from his phone, which assisted them in locating him from the sky. The helicopter carefully lowered down 2 rescuers who then had to use harnesses and climbing ropes, that's how steep this terrain is, to reach the stranded man. Eventually, they were able to get everybody into the helicopter and off to safety. And as if that wasn't already crazy enough, North Shore Rescue stated that the exact cliff they had made this rescue on was the site where a hiker had fallen to his death 2 years earlier. Now, they don't believe that the deceased hiker was using Google Maps, but they did note that the September rescue was likely the result of the hiker trying to follow this non-existent trail, just like the more recent rescue from November. The rescuers and pilots I'm talking about here are obviously extremely skilled, and thank God for that, because if they didn't exist, the north side of Mount Frome would probably have 2 additional fatalities in its records. Going back to the November rescue, this particular hiker was apparently very ill-equipped for a trip into the backcountry. He apparently had very little gear with him, he didn't have the right footwear, and perhaps worst of all, he didn't have a headlamp or a flashlight. If you take anything away from this video, it's that you should always have a headlamp with you anytime you're in the backcountry. I know you have a flashlight on your phone, but you can't rely on that. Always, always, always have a headlamp, even if you're only planning on being out for a few hours. The rescuers couldn't identify the exact location of the man, and so they took their best guess and they lowered a team down onto the dangerous slope of the mountain to start searching. And by some miracle, they were able to navigate through the terrain on a roped belay system, I guess, and they found him. They located the man. They helped him into a harness, and they helped him up into the helicopter, and everyone was safely extracted just moments before cloud cover apparently would have made it impossible for them to do so. I still don't know why this fake trail existed on Google Maps, but my understanding is that it has since been removed and that signs have been installed in the area warning potential hikers to stay the hell away. Apparently, there have been other reports of fake trails popping up on Google Maps. And so let me just say that under no circumstance should you ever rely on Google Maps for backcountry navigation. Even hiking specific apps like AllTrails are often wrong. And so you always need to do your due diligence when picking a hiking route. You gotta cross-reference it between multiple sources, and ideally you should be carrying a paper map in addition to a legitimate GPS app like Far Out, Gaia, CalTopo, apps like that. I've linked North Shore Rescue's website in the description if you're interested in checking them out or making a donation. So clearly this hiker's cell phone nearly ended up killing him, but in our next story, a hiker's cell phone almost saved him. Almost. In late October 2021, yet another anonymous hiker ran into trouble on Mount Elbert. Mount Elbert is the tallest mountain in the state of Colorado, and it's also the tallest mountain in all of the Rocky Mountains. But despite its height, apparently the trails up Mount Elbert don't require any climbing, specialized gear, or technical skills. But of course, that definitely does not mean that it's an easy hike. Depending on the route that you take, you're looking at thousands of feet in elevation gain, sustained periods of time spent at altitude, and of course, potential weather hazards. In October, it's not even uncommon for the higher elevations to already have some snow accumulation, which was the case in 2021. Around 8 p.m. on October 18th, rescuers were informed that a hiker on Mount Elbert was overdue. A team was immediately dispatched to search the area, but by 3 a.m. the following morning, they still had not located the missing hiker, and they needed to take a break. During the search period, numerous calls were made to the hiker's cell phone, but these calls went unanswered. Rescuers assumed that this could have been due to lack of service, or maybe the phone was broken. But with that said, it's definitely not uncommon for cell connections to go through when somebody is high in the mountains, and so it was definitely worth a shot. Searchers resumed their efforts around 7 a.m., but at 9:30, they were informed that this lost hiker had somehow made it back to their car and all the way back to their place of lodging. Apparently, the hiker had gotten lost off the trail just around sunset, and they wandered around in the dark all night trying to relocate the trail. They did find it eventually, and then they navigated around among a few different trails until they finally reached the trailhead where their car was parked roughly 24 hours after they had started their hike. So, given all those details, this seems like a pretty straightforward scenario, maybe even an insignificant one, given how quickly it was resolved and given that the hiker was completely fine. There is one important detail, however, that makes this story fascinating, perhaps even a bit frustrating. So after this hiker made it back to safety, rescuers learned that the hiker had in fact received search and rescue's calls on their cell phone, but had chosen to ignore them because they didn't recognize the number. This hiker apparently figured that the calls were coming from spam callers. Now, I don't normally make jokes in these more serious videos, but I don't know, given the hiker was okay and nothing tragic ended up happening here, I do think it's kind of funny to imagine this lost hiker like stumbling around in the pitch black in the wilderness, like probably pretty scared and frustrated, only to see some spam calls pop up on their cell phone, which then just like pisses them off even further. I don't know. I'm not trying to be insensitive, and I'm certainly glad this hiker was okay. And one thing I will say is that before you rush to criticize this hiker in the comments, I do think that it's important to note that the hiker themselves did not call for search and rescue. It was somebody else at home that called, and so this hiker didn't know that anybody was out looking for them. Obviously, they were lost in the woods at night. They were probably a little panicked, and so while the cell phone thing is a bit humorous and frustrating in hindsight, I don't know, I think we can all understand how it happened. And so, I don't know, please just show this particular hiker and the other hikers I talked about today some grace. Lake County Search and Rescue was responsible for this search, and so I will also have their page linked in the description. And once again, I encourage you to make a donation, and I encourage you to support all these search and rescue organizations I talk about. The work that they do is incredibly difficult, dangerous, and all the groups that I call out in my videos are volunteers. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 3 photos taken by hikers that may look normal at first glance, but are deeply disturbing once you learn the full story behind them. From the rugged mountains of Hawaii to the frigid peaks of California, these stories should serve as a reminder to all of you to keep your wits about you when you're hiking. And make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video, because the last photo and story that I'm going to share has an interesting and fateful twist to it that I doubt many of you will see coming. To start, we're going to head to an area that I myself spent a lot of time hiking in back in March, the Hawaiian island of Oahu. This right here is seriously one of the most disturbing photos ever taken by a hiker, and I'm going to explain why that is and tell you the story. But first, I would please ask you to subscribe to the channel. My goal is to get this channel to 200,000 subscribers. We're getting very close. Thank you so much to everyone who's already subscribed, and if you haven't, and I know a lot of you haven't, by the way, because nearly 80% of my viewers right now are not subscribed. If you haven't subscribed, please do it and help me get to that goal. Okay, back to this disturbing photo and disturbing story. On February 27th, 2015, Dalen Pua decided to hike the Haiku Stairs on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Pua was only 18 years old at the time, a senior in high school, and was visiting Oahu from the Big Island where he lived. Now, the Haiku Stairs are a very famous place. Perhaps you could even say infamous. They consist of almost 4,000 steps that were built by the US Navy during World War II after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, which occurred, by the way, less than 10 miles away from the location of the stairs. The stairs were constructed in 1942 to be exact, and their purpose was to provide access to an antenna system that sat high up on the ridge of the Haiku Valley's peaks. This antenna system served the top secret Haiku radio station, which was used to communicate with US Navy ships sailing in the Pacific as far away as Tokyo Bay. After the war, the radio station and its stairs were transferred over to the US Coast Guard, who ended up making some improvements to the structure and even opened it up to the public starting in the 1970s. However, by 1987, the radio station was officially closed and the stairs were now off limits to the public. The Haiku Stairs were now an illegal hike. But as we all know, just because something is illegal does not mean that people aren't gonna do it. Despite the stairs being closed to the public, hikers continued to climb them. Not only are they an incredibly unique feature, but they also provide access to a beautiful peak whose name I have no chance of pronouncing. I'm sorry, I'm not even gonna try, but this is the name of the peak. The beauty of the area has caused the Haiku Stairs to take on an alternate name, one that a lot of you are probably more familiar with, the Stairway to Heaven. I actually hiked this peak a few months ago, but not on the illegal haiku stairs, but rather the Moana Middle Ridge Trail, which goes up the mountain on the opposite side of the stairs and ends where the top of the stairs meet the peak. It's an awesome route, but it's not as famous as the stairs, and thus every single day hikers continue to tackle the peak via the illegal route. And back in 2015, Dalen Pua was one of these hikers. Pua was visiting his grandmother in the town of Waianae and had told her that he was interested in hiking up the stairway to heaven. However, his grandmother informed him that the hike was illegal and strongly discouraged him from doing it. It appears as though Pua disregarded his grandmother's warning, and on Friday, February 27th, he left her house and got on a bus. And after this, he was never seen alive again. When Dalen Pua failed to return home that evening, his grandmother reported him missing. Police were quick to jump on the case, and it wasn't long before they discovered that Pua had actually texted some pictures to his friends around 11 a.m. the day that he went missing. These pictures placed him on the haiku stairs. Numerous groups came together to search for him, including volunteers, firefighters, and even the group that built the stairs in the first place, the U.S. Navy. For 4 days, they searched the area, but found no trace of Pua. The day before the search was suspended, 2 hikers reported that they had heard cries for help, whatever that means, in the area. Though I haven't been able to find any other details about this bizarre incident, so I'm assuming they never really found out what that was about. And unfortunately, on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2015, the search for Pua was suspended. Desperate to find any clues about Pua's disappearance, his family began closely studying the photos that he had texted out. And much to their surprise, or perhaps their horror, in one of the photos, they discovered a suspicious man obscured in the background by some brush. So naturally, the question is, who is this man? And unfortunately, we still don't know an answer to that. Despite this photo being plastered all over the news and in numerous forums on Facebook and Reddit and just all over social media, the man in the photo has not been identified. And this isn't shocking because, as you can see, you can't really make out any specific details about the man from the zoomed in photo. Dalen Pua's fate remains unknown, even to this day. His body has never been found, and that's all despite the fact that, again, even though they're illegal, the haiku stairs are still a very popular hike. It's certainly possible that the man in the photo had nothing to do with Pua's disappearance, or even that Pua hadn't even noticed him when he snapped the photo, but it's also possible that the man was following Pua and he may be the only one that really knows the true story behind Pua's fate. Either way, the circumstances surrounding this photo are very disturbing, as are the circumstances surrounding this photo as well. In early December 2019, 52-year-old Sri Mokapati and 3 of his friends decided to hike Mount Baldy in the San Gabriel Mountains of Southern California. Mount Baldy is officially known as Mount San Antonio and is the highest peak in Los Angeles County, rising to 10,064 feet above sea level. There are numerous hiking trails on all sides of the mountain that lead to the summit, and one of the more popular ones is the Bear Canyon Trail, which starts right at the Mount Baldy village and climbs over 6 miles and nearly 6,000 feet in elevation gain to the top of the mountain. This is the trail that Mokapati and his friends decided to tackle on December 8th, 2019. Even though Mount Baldy is in Southern California, a place that's obviously known for being quite warm, its high elevation and mountainous terrain makes it a cold and snowy hike in the winter months. At some point on the climb up the mountain, Mokapati's friends decided it was no longer safe to proceed and wanted to turn around. My understanding is that they made this decision based on the wintry, cold conditions that they were facing on the climb. For unknown reasons, perhaps just a simple desire to reach the summit, Mokapati wanted to continue on, even by himself, and he told his friends that he would simply meet them after he had returned from the hike and after he had summited the mountain. Just after he parted ways with the rest of his group, his friend turned back around and decided to snap a quick photo of Mokapati. His friend didn't know it at the time, but this photo would end up being the last photo ever taken of Mokapati alive. It's really an eerie scene. It shows Mokapati's silhouette heading up the mountain all by himself, surrounded with thick fog and snow. The friend who took the photo was later quoted saying, "I keep reliving that moment in my mind." He, referring to Mokapati, muttered something. I didn't quite hear what he said, and then he just kept walking. This friend also stated that he really wished he had told Mokapati to turn around and head back down with the rest of the group, and that after he snapped this photo, Mokapati just seemed to disappear off into the distance. When he failed to return to his car later that day, Mokapati's friends became concerned and they contacted the authorities. Overnight temperatures were going to be hovering around freezing that night, and Mokapati was only prepared for a day hike. He was not carrying any warm overnight gear with him. A massive search was started with rescue volunteer teams from multiple counties in Southern California and multiple helicopters. They searched the wilderness through waist-deep snow at times, all the way up to 7,000 feet in elevation. They even ended up rescuing a few other hikers, I think just by coincidence, but no sign of Mokapati was ever found. Then, a week into the search, a worst case scenario occurred. And it's not the worst case scenario that you might be thinking. Tim Staples was a 9-year veteran of the West Valley Search and Rescue Team and was one of the hundreds of searchers looking for Mokapati. At some point during his search, Staples became separated from his search partners and was eventually located via helicopter in a, quote, area of ice and snow. When rescuers finally got to him, he was unresponsive and was soon declared dead. It's not exactly clear to me what happened, but his death was accidental. It just seems like he probably took a fall while searching in the harsh, icy terrain. It's super tragic that a rescuer ended up dying in the process of trying to save somebody else's life. And it wasn't long after this tragic incident that the sheriff's department decided to suspend the search for Mokapati. And then, approximately 5 months after his disappearance, 2 hikers stumbled upon the remains of Mokapati. The date was June 19th, 2020, and the discovery was made on the northwest side of Mount Baldy near the top of Fish Fork, around 7,800 feet in elevation. The news of Mokapati's death makes this photo even more disturbing, since we now know that it shows a man marching off all by himself straight towards death. This next photo also shows a hiker heading straight towards death, but the story behind this one has a much different ending. On Monday, April 12, 2021, Renee Compine decided to hike near Mount Waterman in California's San Gabriel Mountains. I'll note, this is roughly the same area that the previous story occurred in. He parked at the Buckhorn Campground and Trailhead and started hiking, although it's unclear to me still which trail exactly that he took. Everything appeared to have started out fine, but then later that evening, one of Compine's friends got a text that must have sent chills up his spine. Renee Compine texted his friend this photo. It shows his dirty legs dangling over a cliff, and later on that day, Compine texted that same friend stating that he was lost and his cell phone was nearly out of battery. His friend reported him missing around 6 p.m. that evening, and searchers quickly set out to try to find him, fearing the worst would happen if Compine had to spend a night unprepared in the cold mountains all by himself. The first thing rescuers did was try to use the photo to pinpoint Compine's location. Unfortunately, no one was able to recognize the terrain shown in the photo, and so they turned their attention to the metadata attached to the photo. They were hoping this photo contained a location code embedded in its back end. But when they analyzed the metadata, they struck out once again. Compine had turned his location off on his cell phone, providing no additional clues to his whereabouts. But the searchers had one more trick up their sleeves. This time they turned to the public and plastered the photo all over social media, hoping that someone would recognize it. A Facebook post from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department read, quote, "Are you an avid hiker in the Mount Waterman area? Search and rescue teams need your help locating a missing hiker. His car was found near Buckhorn Campground / Trailhead. It is unknown which trail he took from there." The missing hiker sent this picture to his friend earlier in the hike. The hiker's legs in the picture look dirty, possibly from a burn area on the mountain. If you recognize the area pictured below, please call us. And sure enough, miraculously, within hours of this post going up, a call came in. A random man who saw the post was somehow able to just analyze the photo and come up with the exact coordinates from where it was taken. This man was quoted saying, "I've got a very weird hobby, which is I love taking a look at photos and figuring out where they've been taken." This man passed the coordinates on to investigators who were then able to zero in on this specific area to search. By this point, one night had passed and the chances of Compine's survival were diminishing by the minute. But armed with the coordinates of Compine's last photo, a helicopter was sent out, and it wasn't long before they spotted him. The helicopter flew low and close to the mountain in the area of Twin Peaks East and Triplet Rocks. Once they spotted Compine, he was quickly airlifted out, and soon after he was actually able to meet the man who had identified his photo, likely saving his life. Compine told the man, quote, "I crazy appreciate what you did. I really don't know if I could make it there another day. It was just so cold." After his rescue, Compine actually came under scrutiny from the government because he had wandered into an area of the forest that was closed due to the previous bobcat fire. They announced that he would potentially face a fine of $10,000 and 6 months in jail due to his actions, but I wasn't able to find any updates other than that initial announcement, so I'm not sure if he was ever charged or if the charges were dropped. Unlike the first two stories, this one fortunately has a happy ending. But that doesn't make the photo any less disturbing, because if it wasn't for a tech-savvy hiker with a bizarre hobby, this photo would have almost certainly been Rene Compine's last photo. I'm glad he survived, and my heart certainly goes out to Pua and Mokapati, and of course, all their friends and families. July 9th, 2013. This is the infamous day that one of the most bizarre disappearances in national forest history took place. A 19-year-old girl and some of her friends were staying at a remote campground in Washington state, and their trip had started off uneventful. However, this would soon change, because during the evening, the girl stood up and told her friends that she would be going out on a spiritual quest. She then stripped completely naked and marched out of the campground carrying only a small fanny pack. She wasn't even wearing any shoes. And while this basic explanation of the story might already seem extremely bizarre, I assure you that the more details you learn, the more confused and perhaps disturbed you will become. As this mystery has dragged on, more and more important yet unanswered questions have emerged. Why did she take off all of her clothes? Where was her intended destination when she left the campground? Had she taken any drugs before she departed? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what the hell happened to her? After Maureen Kelly left the campground, she would never be seen again. Her departure would mark the very beginning of a mystery that has lasted over a decade with no end in sight. This is the unsolved disappearance of Maureen Kelly and the unanswered questions that surround it. So, if you couldn't tell from that intro, this is one of the strangest stories I've ever covered on my channel. And one of the things that makes it so strange is the fact that there's not that much information out there on it. Now, don't get me wrong, it was covered by local news and briefly touched upon by national publications, and there's also been some Reddit threads talking about it, but I don't know, compared to a lot of the stories I've covered, this one, for whatever reason, hasn't received that much attention. And given the nature of this case, I really can't believe that more people aren't talking about it. And so my hope is that by making this video, we can do just that, get more people talking about it, and just maybe inch a tiny bit closer to a resolution for Maureen's loved ones. On June 9th, 2013, 19-year-old Maureen Kelly and some of her friends went camping in Washington state. They chose the Canyon Creek Campground, a remote spot located in the southwestern part of the state. Now, my understanding is that Canyon Creek Campground has since been closed, and I'm not exactly sure of the details. I saw some conversation on various Reddit threads talking about the road into the campground being damaged and impassable, but I also saw some comments saying you can still access the campground even though it's not officially open. I'm honestly not exactly sure what's going on there. Canyon Creek Campground is located in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, an area that encompasses well over 1 million acres and is home to most of Mount Adams, which is the second highest peak in Washington state. The Pacific Crest Trail also passes through Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and by my best estimation, it runs some 15 miles east of Canyon Creek Campground. Maureen Kelly is not the only hiker to have disappeared in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. In fact, a few months after she vanished, Christopher Zitzowitz disappeared further east in the national forest in the vicinity of Goose Lake. He has never been found, and it's suspected that he fell into one of the caves or lava tubes in the area. But back to Maureen Kelly, she actually went by a nickname, which was Anu, and she was from Vancouver, Washington, which is a suburb of Portland, Oregon, just a bit north of the city. I'm not gonna lie, there isn't too much public information available about Anu, but I did find that she graduated from Lewis and Clark High School and that she was a very talented musician. In a disturbing twist, this video right here of her playing was recorded only 2 days before she went missing, and she was known as a great singer and ukulele player by her friends and family. Her half-sister described her as, quote, a very laid-back, carefree girl. Now, I swear I'm not trying to come across as insensitive here, but perhaps Anu was a bit too carefree, given the next series of events that I'm about to cover. On June 7th, 2013, just 2 days before her disappearance, Anu posted this on her Facebook page. I don't know the details and logistics of her camping trip, but clearly she found some people to go with, because the camping trip that she is referencing here would end up being the start of this entire mystery. I find this Facebook post incredibly disturbing. It's also reported that Anu called her half-sister before she left on the camping trip and asked her about borrowing some gear. She said that she was excited to go, and nothing on the call seemed suspicious or out of the ordinary. On June 9th, Anu and her friends made their way to campsite number 3 at Canyon Creek Campground, where they presumably set up and hung around for a while. Everything seemed completely normal until 5 p.m. rolled around. It's around this time that Anu announced to the group that she was going on a, quote, spiritual quest. It's unclear to me if she told the group when she was expected to return. One source stated that she told the group she would be back by midnight, but another source said that she never gave a return time, and so I'm not really sure. I am, however, sure of the next bizarre part of this story. After announcing that she would be going on this spiritual quest, Anu apparently stripped naked and headed off into the woods. And by naked, I really mean naked. She wasn't wearing any clothing. Apparently, she wasn't even wearing shoes, which I can't even imagine trudging off into the wilderness with nothing to protect my feet. That's wow. The only thing that Anu took with her was a small fanny pack, which apparently, I'm not exactly sure of the contents, but it's been reported that she had a knife, some matches, and a compass inside that fanny pack. Another thing that's unclear to me is how the friends she was camping with responded to her departure naked, but I did find this quote from Sheriff David Cox, who was involved in the investigation. He said, quote, Anu had talked about doing this spiritual quest for evidently quite some time. The folks that she was with, they felt that this was something she needed to do. Now, on this note, I do want to say that I noticed a number of people in various threads and online discussions being quite harsh towards her friends for allowing Anu to just venture off on her own. I think it's safe to say that, yes, allowing your friend to just head off into the wilderness alone, completely naked, was not the right move. But before you start ripping on her friends in the comment section, let me just say this. It's easy to criticize people's actions in the wake of a tragedy like this, but I'm assuming these friends were similar age to Anu. They're probably, 18, 19, young adults with limited outdoor experience. And let's be honest, we all made bad choices when we were that age. And also, imagine you're out camping with a group of friends. I don't know, it's a lot easier said than done to be the one person who kind of speaks up and objects to what one of your other friends is going to be doing and their decision making. So I don't know, just keep all of this in mind before you start blaming Anu's friends. It's like, yeah, they probably should have said something, but I don't know. I think it's a little more complicated than that. And at the end of the day, Anu and Anu only is responsible for the choices that she made. After Anu left Canyon Creek Campground, she was never seen again. And to her friend's credit, they did actually report her missing quite quickly. I would even say a lot faster than usual compared to other stories I've covered on this channel. Just after midnight, so this is going to be really early on, June 10th at this point, her friends called the sheriff's office and reported that Anu had not returned to camp. A search was quickly launched, and initially it actually seemed quite promising. Very quickly, searchers located some bare footprints that were the same size as Anu's feet, and they were able to follow them across Canyon Creek, which would have been the first obstacle that Anu would have faced after leaving the campground. The footprints then led up out of the canyon until they intersected Forest Road 54. This meant that Anu traveled roughly 600 feet-ish, at least 600 feet, I should say, which might not sound like much, but I do want you to keep in mind that this is very difficult terrain, especially if you're walking barefoot. One of the volunteer searchers was quoted saying, "It's very, very steep. So how she got down there barefoot," referring to the creek that is a wonder. And how she came up out of the bottom is a wonder. Once searchers reached Forest Road 54, they were unable to follow Anu's tracks any further. They even brought in canine units, but unfortunately, the dogs couldn't pick up any further scent. They continued searching for the rest of the day, finding no further clues. Searches resumed the next day with similarly disappointing results. Maureen Kelly was nowhere to be found. Now, I'm a little bit confused about the details of the search after this second day. Apparently the search was suspended. I don't know, that just seems pretty early to me, but then it resumed shortly after, I guess. I didn't really get a clear answer as to what happened there. But regardless of this temporary pause, the search continued until June 15th. And on that day, 75 volunteers combed through 4 square miles of terrain all the way until 6 p.m. And at that point, they still hadn't found anything, and the search was officially called off. To this day, the fate of Anu remains a mystery. So that's the story, essentially, but it's not the end of the video. I'm guessing that all those details left you confused and with a lot of unanswered questions, and if that's the case, you're not alone. I feel like the official reporting on this case left a lot to be desired, and to be clear, I'm not trying to blame the searchers or even the media here. We just don't know very much about what happened, and unfortunately, we're really only left to speculate. So yeah, I have a lot of unanswered questions, and the first one is related to Forest Road 54, where searchers lost Anu's tracks. So this seems like an obvious lead. I mean, doesn't it? If her tracks stopped at the road, is it possible that she was picked up by a passing vehicle, either voluntarily or against her will? This would be, and I guess still is, a promising theory, but the police have come out and stated that they don't believe foul play was involved with her disappearance. But I don't know, can we be so sure about that? It's also possible that if she got picked up at the road, it wasn't foul play, it was something else. And I did see some chatter online about her potentially getting picked up to go join a commune, but this just seemed like wild speculation to me. I don't really have any information about it, and so if anyone in the comments knows more about this, please let us know. Another question I have, and I want to be careful with this one because, again, this is just speculation and nothing more, but is there a chance that Anu was either intoxicated or on drugs when she wandered off into the woods? I did read one media report that stated the sheriff specifically said that there was no indication that she was on drugs at the time of her disappearance, and to be fair, that account is probably more credible than the next ones that I'm gonna mention. I do just want to say though, I read a number of comments online from people who claimed to have known Anu, who stated that she had in fact taken hallucinogenic drugs that evening that she disappeared. Now, in almost every case I've covered, I've seen wild speculation on Reddit forums and other places online, and I normally don't take these comments very seriously. In this case, I saw a number of comments from different people stating that she was not sober, and given the bizarre details of her disappearance, mostly the fact that she stripped naked, to be honest, I don't know, this does seem like consistent behavior from someone who was maybe not in the right state of mind. But again, make no mistake about it, this is just speculation, and so while I do think it's worth a mention here, I'm still hesitant to really take these claims seriously. And also, I can't help but wonder what her intended destination was when she wandered off from the campground. Now, it's definitely possible that she was just planning on strolling around, but if we do find out that she had a specific endpoint in mind, that could really help to narrow down the areas to search. And also, I gotta ask, I mean, another pretty obvious question, why was she naked? I guess you could chalk it up to the whole spiritual aspect. I mean, that is probably the reason why, I guess, but like, I don't know. Even with that in mind, it still just feels bizarre that she would take off all her clothes, especially her shoes. And let's be honest, perhaps the biggest unanswered question of this entire mystery is what the hell happened to Maureen Kelly? And there's a few possible scenarios at play here, one of them being the aforementioned possibility that she got picked up at the road. But then again, the authorities don't really seem to believe that this happened. At least that's the interpretation I got from researching this case, which leaves the obvious theory that she just wandered off into the woods, maybe got lost or injured, and died as a result. Now, in my opinion, this is probably the most likely outcome. She easily could have become immobile due to a foot injury, because again, she wasn't wearing shoes, or maybe she could have fallen more easily because she didn't have good traction on her feet. And another thing I need to mention here is that the weather around the time of her disappearance makes this theory even more probable. Temperatures were mild the evening that she disappeared, but they did apparently drop into the 40s later on that night, and there was also some light rain as well. This makes hypothermia a very real possibility, so perhaps she died as a result of that, especially given she didn't have any clothing to keep her warm or to protect her from the elements. But again, if that's the case, then why hasn't her body been discovered? I mean, it's been over 10 years and a lot of searching at this point. I always do my best researching these stories, but this is such a wild one, and honestly, there's not that much information, so there's definitely a chance I missed something. So if you have any more important details, please leave them in the comments. We may never know what happened to Anu, but I really do hope that someday her friends and her family are able to get some closure. It's a bizarre and tragic situation, and I don't know, I hope that some increased awareness of this case will someday help lead to a resolution. I send my best wishes to her loved ones, and I encourage you to do the same in the comments section. On a less important note, if you made it this far into the video, I ask that you consider hitting the subscribe button and help us get to our next goal of 500,000 subscribers. We recently passed 300,000, and I'm so grateful for all of you who have already subscribed. But I do know for a fact that the vast majority of you watching right now have not subscribed. So if that's you, please subscribe to the channel, especially if you're a repeat viewer. Thank you all so much for watching, and please keep Maureen Kelly, her friends, her family, all of her loved ones in your hearts.